Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you are here tonight. Settle into whatever place feels comfortable. You may be listening from a bedroom with the lights turned low, from a couch after a long day, or through a pair of headphones while the rest of your home has gone quiet. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice the ordinary sounds around you. A car passing outside, a door closing somewhere in the building, the low hum of an appliance, perhaps a few voices from the street. Most of the time, these sounds mean very little. They blend into the background and we barely register them. But there have been places and periods in American history when a car slowing down outside could make everyone in a house stop talking. A knock at the door after dark could bring fear before curiosity. A short walk to a nearby shop could require decisions about which street to use, which clothes to wear, and whether it was safe to go alone. Tonight, we are going to Los Angeles. Not the Los Angeles of movie premieres, hillside mansions, beaches, studio gates and postcards. We are going south of downtown into neighbourhoods that were home to hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. Families raised children there. Workers left early in the morning for factories, warehouses, hospitals, restaurants and construction sites. Teenagers walked to school. Churches opened their doors on Sundays. Music came through apartment windows. People washed cars in driveways, argued over parking spaces, borrowed sugar from neighbours and tried to build stable lives. These communities were not born violent. That point matters, because the story is often told backward. People see the homicide totals, police footage, mugshots, gang names and images of buildings burning in 1992, and they assume that violence was somehow the natural condition of south-central Los Angeles. It was not. The violence developed over time. It grew through specific decisions, economic changes, political failures, neighbourhood rivalries, police practices, and personal acts of retaliation. None of those causes operated alone, and none of them can explain the whole story. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning where you are, or has the day already ended? You can leave your city or country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you appreciate slow, detailed history that spends time with the people who lived through it, you can like the video and subscribe to the channel. There is no need to interrupt what you are doing. You can decide later, after the story has given you something worth remembering. For now, let us begin with a street. It is the late 1970s, and the sun has recently gone down over south-central Los Angeles. The name South Central does not describe one small neighbourhood. It refers to a broad part of the city made up of many communities, each with its own streets, schools, churches, businesses, housing projects and local identities. Residents do not experience the area as a single block of territory. They know the differences between Watts, Florence, Green Meadows, Vermont Square, West Adams, Central Alameda, and dozens of smaller areas that outsiders often group together. A boy standing outside a corner store may be only a few miles from downtown Los Angeles, but those miles can feel much greater. He knows where his friends live. He knows which schoolyards are safe after dark. He knows the alleys that connect one street to another. He knows which older boys are respected and which ones are feared. He may also know that crossing a certain avenue can cause trouble, even when he has no intention of causing any himself. The boundaries are rarely marked on official maps. There are no gates at the intersections. No signs inform drivers that they have entered a different territory. The border may be a wide boulevard, a set of railroad tracks, a housing development, a school, or simply an agreement understood by young people in the area. To someone driving through, it is an ordinary street. To someone living there, it may be a line with consequences. By the end of the 1970s, Los Angeles County officials were already describing a sharp increase in gang-related violence. One federal criminal justice summary reported 168 gang-related homicides in the county in 1977 and 351 in 1980. The numbers were not yet at the levels they would reach later, but the direction was clear. More young people were being drawn into neighbourhood groups, more rivalries were becoming armed, and more disputes were ending in death rather than injury. The names that would become internationally known were already spreading across Los Angeles: Crips and Bloods. These were not two unified organisations with one leader on each side. That common image is misleading. The Crips were composed of separate neighbourhood groups, usually called sets. The Bloods were also divided into sets with their own leadership, alliances, enemies, and local histories. Two groups could use the same larger identity and still distrust or fight one another. A young person did not simply join the Crips in the way someone might join a national organisation. He usually became associated with a particular neighbourhood set, and that local affiliation could matter more than the larger name. The most widely accepted accounts place the formation of the early Crips around 1969, closely associated with Raymond Washington and later Stanley Tookie Williams. As Crip-affiliated groups expanded during the early 1970s, other neighbourhood gangs formed or aligned for protection. Groups including the Pyrrhus and Brims became part of the loose alliance that came to be known as the Bloods. Within a few years, Crip and Blood identities had spread through many parts of South Los Angeles. That short description is accurate, but it's too simple to explain what happened. Young people in Los Angeles had formed neighbourhood groups long before the words Crip and Blood were used. Earlier groups organised around housing projects, schools, car clubs, dances, sports, and local social life. Rivalries existed in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Some involved fistfights, theft, vandalism, and attacks between neighbourhoods. Violence was real, but the scale, weaponry, and economic environment were different from what would develop in the 1980s. The generation that created the early Crip and Blood sets grew up in a city shaped by segregation. Black families who came to Los Angeles during and after the Second World War often arrived seeking industrial jobs and an escape from the legal segregation of the South. They found new opportunities, but they also encountered restrictive housing practices, discrimination, and neighbourhoods where racial boundaries were enforced through policy, finance, intimidation, and sometimes direct violence. Even after formal housing discrimination was challenged, its effects remained visible. Families had been concentrated into specific areas. Public investment was uneven. Schools reflected neighbourhood inequality. Jobs were often located far from the communities where workers lived. Police relations had been damaged by years of aggressive enforcement and repeated allegations of brutality. In August 1965, the arrest of a young black driver in Watts led to 6 days of unrest. 34 people died, more than 1,000 were injured, and large sections of the area were damaged. The official investigation that followed did not describe the uprising as an inexplicable explosion. It pointed to unemployment, poor schools, inadequate housing, difficult police-community relations, and the isolation of residents from political and economic opportunity. The buildings were eventually cleared. Some businesses returned, and some did not. The television cameras moved on. The underlying problems remained. This is one of the most important facts in the story. The rise of the Crips and Bloods did not occur in an empty space. It occurred after older neighbourhood institutions had been weakened, and after the hopes created by the civil rights era had failed to produce equal conditions in many parts of Los Angeles. During the 1960s, political organisations, community groups, churches, civil rights activists, and black nationalist movements offered young people different ways to build identity and authority. Some organised breakfast programs, political education, neighbourhood patrols, and campaigns against police abuse. Law enforcement agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and local police departments, treated several of these organisations as serious threats. Leaders were watched, arrested, divided by informants, or killed. Internal disputes also damaged the groups. By the beginning of the 1970s, many of the institutions that had attracted politically active young people were weaker than they had been only a few years earlier. Neighbourhood gangs did not simply replace those organisations in a direct or organised transfer. History is rarely that neat. But the disappearance of strong community movements left fewer places where angry and ambitious teenagers could find belonging, discipline, protection, and public importance. Local street groups offered versions of those things, though without the same political purpose. For a teenager, the attraction could be immediate. Membership meant that people knew your name. It meant older boys might defend you. It meant you were less likely to face a hostile group alone. It offered reputation in a society where many young men felt ignored everywhere else. It could provide friendship, excitement, and a sense of control over a small area, even when the larger city seemed uninterested in what happened there. It also created obligations. An insult directed at one member could become an insult directed at the entire set. A fistfight at school could bring retaliation from friends and relatives. An attack committed on Monday might produce a response on Friday, followed by another response weeks later. The original reason could become less important with each new injury. This is how a personal dispute becomes neighbourhood history. A teenager may not know who began a rivalry. He only knows that someone from the other side shot his cousin. The teenager on the other side remembers a brother who was attacked earlier. Both families have funerals. Both groups believe they are responding rather than initiating. Each death becomes evidence that the enemy cannot be trusted, and every act of retaliation creates the reason for the next one. The process is easy to describe from a distance, and extremely difficult to stop from inside it. Imagine being 15 years old and living 3 blocks from a rival neighbourhood. You have known some of those young people since elementary school. Perhaps you played basketball together before either of you understood the local alliances. Now you attend different schools, wear different colours, spend time with different older boys, and hear different versions of the same recent shooting. One evening a car passes slowly, the windows are down. Someone inside calls out a question. It may be a challenge asking where you're from. It may be an insult. It may be nothing you can clearly hear. Everyone near you reacts. At that moment, your choices are not being made in the quiet safety of hindsight. They are being made in front of friends, under pressure, with fear and pride operating together. Walking away may protect your life, but it may also be interpreted as weakness. Responding may earn approval, but it may turn a brief encounter into a permanent feud. The people involved are young, but the consequences are adult and irreversible. During the late 1970s, firearms were already part of gang conflict, though many confrontations still involved fists, knives, bats, or inexpensive handguns. The later image of heavily armed groups using military-style weapons did not yet define every street. That change would come gradually as guns became more available and the drug economy provided greater amounts of cash. Drive-by shootings also existed before the crack era. Shooting from a moving vehicle offered attackers speed, surprise, and distance. It reduced the need to confront a rival face-to-face and made immediate escape easier. It also made violence less precise. A fistfight usually has visible participants. A bullet fired from a car does not respect the social rules of a rivalry. It can pass through a wall, strike a child in a front yard, hit someone waiting at a bus stop, or kill a person who has no connection to either gang. Once drive-by shootings became more common, ordinary parts of neighbourhood life changed. Standing outside became a risk. House parties required someone to watch the street. Parents told children not to gather near windows. Families learned to drop to the floor when they heard gunfire, sometimes before they knew how far away it was. A person walking home might remove a hat or jacket because its colour could be misunderstood. Drivers avoided certain blocks. Teenagers gave friends rides for distances that would normally take only a few minutes to walk. Residents learned to distinguish fireworks, backfiring engines, and gunshots by sound, though mistakes were easy and certainty often came too late. The violence did not fall equally on everyone, but everyone had to account for it. Most residents of South Central were not gang members. They were parents, children, shopkeepers, teachers, bus drivers, nurses, factory workers, ministers, retirees, and students. They did not control the rivalries around them. Many actively resisted them through churches, youth programs, neighbourhood organisations, sports leagues, and informal intervention. Mothers confronted recruiters. Relatives sent children to live with family members in other parts of California. Coaches tried to keep teenagers at practice after school. Community activists organised peace meetings that rarely received the same attention as shootings. Yet residents were often spoken about as though they were part of the danger simply because of where they lived. That outside perception had serious consequences. Employers could reject applicants after seeing a South Central address. Insurance costs could rise. Businesses could decide not to invest. Politicians could treat the area primarily as a policing problem. News reports could show crime scenes without explaining the normal life taking place on every surrounding block. A neighbourhood under pressure could then lose more jobs, more services, and more trust, strengthening the same conditions that allowed gangs to recruit. The police were already a major presence in this environment. The Los Angeles Police Department had developed a national reputation for discipline, centralized authority, and aggressive crime control under Chief William H. Parker, who led the department from 1950 until his death in 1966. Supporters viewed the LAPD as professional and efficient. Many Black and Latino residents experienced it differently. They described stops, searches, insults, beatings, and a style of policing that treated entire neighbourhoods as hostile territory. By the late 1970s, officers entering gang-affected areas faced genuine danger. Some were shot at. Some encountered armed suspects, hostile crowds, and witnesses who refused to cooperate. Police frustration was real. So was community fear of the police. These two facts existed at the same time. Officers often believed residents were protecting gang members. Residents often believed officers arrived assuming everyone was guilty. A witness to a shooting might fear retaliation from the gang if he talked, and mistreatment from police if he did. A mother could want a killer arrested while also worrying that her own sons would be stopped, searched, or beaten during the investigation. This is how distrust becomes practical rather than theoretical. It affects whether someone calls for help. It affects whether a witness identifies a gunman. It affects whether a child sees an officer as protection or danger. It affects whether a homicide is solved. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office created a specialized hardcore gang section in 1979, reflecting official concern about the increasing number of gang-related killings and the difficulty of prosecuting them. Witnesses were often frightened. Cases involved overlapping retaliations, changing stories, and defendants known in the same neighborhoods where witnesses had to continue living. Even the term gang-related could hide complexity. A victim might be an active member, a former member, a relative, a friend, or an uninvolved person standing nearby. A shooting could begin with a territorial rivalry and end with someone entirely unrelated being killed. Police statistics place these deaths into categories. Families experienced them individually. There was a bedroom that remained empty. There was a mother choosing clothes for a funeral. There was a school desk no one used again. There were friends deciding whether to retaliate. By 1980, Los Angeles had not yet entered the worst period of its gang crisis. Crack cocaine had not yet transformed street-level drug markets. The homicide numbers that would shock the city in the late 1980s and early 1990s were still ahead. Semi-automatic firearms had not yet become as common in neighbourhood conflicts. The LAPD had not yet launched the largest and most controversial operations of the coming decade. The beating of Rodney King, the trial of the officers, and the 1992 uprising were years away. But the basic structure was already in place. There were neighbourhoods divided by unofficial boundaries. There were young people inheriting rivalries they had not started. There were families trying to protect children from both recruitment and crossfire. There were police officers entering communities where they expected resistance. There were residents who needed protection but did not trust the people assigned to provide it. There were declining employment opportunities, unequal schools, poor housing conditions, and a growing sense that the larger city noticed South Central mainly when something went wrong. Most evenings still passed without a shooting. People cooked dinner, watched television, worked late shifts, helped children with homework, repaired cars, attended church meetings, and talked on front porches. It is necessary to remember that normal life continued because the history makes no sense without it. Violence is frightening partly because it enters ordinary routines. It interrupts a birthday party, a walk home, a trip to the store, or a conversation outside a house. The residents were not living inside a constant battle scene. They were living in communities where the possibility of sudden violence had become difficult to ignore. That distinction is important. A place can be dangerous without every person in it being dangerous. A neighbourhood can contain powerful gangs without belonging entirely to those gangs. People can love their street, their neighbours, and their community while also fearing what may happen there after dark. As the 1970s ended, the Crips and Bloods continued to expand and divide. New sets adopted the larger identities. Older disagreements became permanent rivalries. Imprisonment carried street affiliations into county jails and state prisons. Young members gained status through acts of violence that would once have been considered extreme. Firearms allowed a small number of people to produce fear across a large area. Then a new drug began appearing on the streets. It was inexpensive in small quantities, easy to sell, highly addictive, and capable of producing large amounts of cash in neighbourhoods where legitimate opportunities were limited. It did not create the Crips or the Bloods, the Crips. It did not invent territorial rivalry, poverty, segregation, police distrust, or gun violence. What it did was pour money into conflicts that were already established. The arrival of crack cocaine changed what territory was worth. A block was no longer only a place connected to identity, friendship, or reputation. It could become a marketplace. Controlling a corner could mean controlling daily sales. Losing that corner could mean losing income. Young men who had once fought over pride could now fight over money, customers, and supply. The weapons changed with the profits. The age of the participants became younger. The cost to everyone living nearby became much higher. To understand how Los Angeles reached that point, we need to return to the years before crack, before drive-by shootings became a common part of the evening news, and before the names Crips and Bloods were known around the world. We need to look at the neighbourhoods that existed before the most famous gangs, the industries that brought black families to Los Angeles, the housing boundaries that limited where they could live, and the political movements that briefly offered another direction. The earlier Los Angeles explains why the streets of the late 1970s were ready for what came next. To understand the streets of South Central Los Angeles in the late 1970s, it helps to forget the images that came later. Forget the television footage of police lines, burning buildings, and helicopters circling over intersections. Forget the crack houses, the drive-by shootings, and the maps of gang territory that made the area look like a collection of coloured zones. Those images belong to a later period. They became so familiar that they often replaced everything that came before them. The South Central Los Angeles of the early 1960s was already poor in many places, already segregated and already troubled by a difficult relationship with the police. But it was also a centre of black family life, business, music, political activity, and work. The streets were full of people trying to establish themselves in a city that had offered them more opportunity than the places many of their families had left, while still refusing them equal access to much of what Los Angeles promised. A generation earlier, thousands of black Americans had moved west from Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and other parts of the South. Some came before the Second World War. Many more arrived during the war, when Southern California's aircraft factories, shipyards, railroads, warehouses, and military industries needed workers. The migration was part of a much larger movement that carried millions of black Americans out of the rural South and into cities in the North and West. They were leaving agricultural labour, segregation, racial terror, and limited political rights. They were moving toward industrial wages and the possibility of a different life. Los Angeles appeared to offer space. That was one of the city's great advertisements. It was not New York. crowded vertically into apartment buildings, it was not Chicago, with its heavy winters and dense industrial neighborhoods. Los Angeles spread outward. It offered small houses, yards, sunlight, automobiles, and the idea that an ordinary working family might own a piece of the city. The promise was real for some people. It was restricted for others. Black families often found that they could obtain jobs building aircraft or loading freight, but could not freely choose where to live. Housing discrimination was enforced through restrictive covenants, real estate practices, lending policies, intimidation, and informal agreements among property owners. Some neighborhoods refused black buyers openly. In others, agents simply claimed that nothing was available. Banks treated black areas as poor risks, which made mortgages difficult to obtain and investment difficult to attract. The result was not an accident. Black residents were concentrated into a limited part of the city, especially along the Central Avenue corridor and in neighborhoods extending south toward Watts. Central Avenue became one of the most important black cultural and commercial districts in the western United States. It had hotels, restaurants, barbershops, churches, doctors' offices, newspapers, clubs, and music venues. Jazz musicians who were denied entry to many white establishments could perform there. Black travelers who could not stay in hotels elsewhere in Los Angeles found rooms near Central Avenue. Families attended churches that served not only as religious institutions, but also as meeting halls, employment networks, political centres, and places where new arrivals could find help. A person arriving from Louisiana might stay with a cousin, hear about a factory opening from someone at church, and find a room through a friend of a friend. These networks made migration possible. They also created neighbourhoods where people knew one another, watched one another's children, and built institutions with limited outside support. This does not mean life was easy. Many houses were overcrowded. Rents could be high because landlords knew tenants had few alternatives. Public services were uneven. Industrial work was physically demanding and often unstable. Black employees were commonly kept out of better paid positions or blocked from promotion. The city's geography made a car nearly essential, but many families could not afford one. A worker might travel a long distance across Los Angeles only to reach a job that could disappear when a contract ended. Still, there was employment. That distinction would become very important later. In the 1950s and early 1960s, a young man without a college education could still imagine leaving school, finding industrial work, earning a wage, and contributing to a household. The work might be difficult and poorly paid compared with what white employees earned, but it created a path into adulthood. It provided a daily schedule, older co-workers, union connections in some industries, and a reason to believe that patience could produce stability. The neighbourhood youth groups of that period developed inside this environment. They were not all criminal gangs in the later sense of the term. Many were groups of teenagers connected to a school, housing project, street, car club, dance hall or skating rink. They organised parties, they played sports, they travelled together because there was safety in numbers. Some fought with groups from other neighbourhoods. Some stole cars, committed robberies or carried weapons. Others moved between ordinary social activity and occasional violence. Research on early black gangs in Los Angeles describes youth groups existing long before the Crips and Bloods. In the 1950s, neighbourhood organisations gathered around house parties, school dances, cars, and roller skating locations. Rivalries developed, and smaller groups sometimes joined together for protection. Other historical work traces black gangs in South Los Angeles as far back as the 1930s, and connects later growth to racism, conflict between neighbourhoods, and life in large public housing developments. The housing projects of Watts were especially important. Developments such as Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens and Imperial Courts were built to provide housing for working families, including defence workers. They were not originally imagined as permanent containers for poverty. They had apartments, courtyards, playgrounds, and neighbours who often developed strong community ties. But public housing could also concentrate families who had few resources while isolating them from the rest of the city. When employment was stable and services were maintained, the projects could function as working-class communities. When jobs disappeared, buildings deteriorated and public institutions withdrew, the same concentration became dangerous. Young people identified closely with the project where they lived. That identity could produce loyalty and protection. It could also create rivalry with young people from another project only a short distance away. A fight might begin at a dance. Someone from one neighbourhood might be seen talking to a girl from another. A car club could enter the wrong area. A teenager could be insulted at a football game. These were small events, but reputation mattered. A young man who allowed an insult to pass might face further challenges. Friends could pressure him to respond. Older brothers and cousins could become involved. The dispute could expand from two individuals to two groups. Most of these conflicts did not yet involve the firepower that would appear in the 1980s. Fists, chains, knives, clubs, and occasional handguns were more common. That did not make the violence harmless. People were injured and killed. But the number of victims in a single incident was usually limited by the weapons being used. The neighbourhood group was also only one possible source of identity. The 1960s brought a different kind of organisation into Black Los Angeles. Civil rights groups, black nationalist organisations, churches, student movements, labour campaigns, and community associations competed for the attention of the young people. They offered political education, public service, self-defence, and a language for understanding racial inequality. The Congress of Racial Equality, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, local ministers, student activists, and neighbourhood organisers worked on housing, employment, schools, and police misconduct. Later in the decade, groups such as the Black Panther Party developed programs that connected political belief with daily neighbourhood needs. They organised food distribution, education, medical support, and campaigns against police brutality. For a young person who felt that the city did not respect him, political organisation could offer status without requiring control of a street corner. It could turn anger into meetings, demonstrations, community programs, and public confrontation with institutions. That did not eliminate gangs. It did provide alternatives. The relationship between black residents and the Los Angeles Police Department remained one of the most serious sources of tension. Under Chief William H. Parker, who led the department from 1950 until 1966, the LAPD became more centralised, disciplined, and independent from local political corruption. Parker was praised for professionalising the department, enforcing internal standards, and creating a force that other cities studied. Even the LAPD's own historical description calls him both celebrated and controversial. Professionalism, however, did not guarantee trust. Parker's model treated the police as a thin line protecting order in a rapidly changing city. Officers were encouraged to see themselves as separate from the communities they patrolled. In black neighbourhoods, this distance could become hostility. Residents complained about humiliating stops, aggressive searches, racist language, beatings, and the assumption that young black men were criminals. Police officers had their own explanation. They argued that they were being sent into high-crime areas where residents often refused to cooperate. They believed strong tactics were necessary to maintain control. Many white Angelenos accepted this view and saw the LAPD as the institution preventing disorder from spreading. The same police action could therefore produce two very different stories. An officer might describe a stop as preventive policing. The young man being pushed against a car might describe it as harassment. The officer might say a crowd became threatening. The crowd might say it gathered because police were beating someone. Each new confrontation confirmed what both sides already believed. On August 11th, 1965, this unstable relationship broke open. That evening, a California Highway Patrol officer stopped 21-year-old Marquette Fry near Watts on suspicion of drunk driving. Fry's brother was with him. Their mother arrived after being told about the stop. A crowd gathered as police attempted to make arrests. Accounts of the exact sequence differed almost immediately. Police said the family resisted. Members of the crowd believed officers were using unnecessary force. Rumours spread that a pregnant woman had been kicked, though the woman involved was not pregnant. What mattered was not only what happened at that intersection. What mattered was that thousands of residents were prepared to believe the worst account because it resembled experiences they had already seen or heard about. The disturbance grew through the night. Over the following days, parts of Watts and surrounding neighbourhoods experienced looting, fires, attacks, shootings, and confrontations with police and the National Guard. 34 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. Thousands were arrested. Buildings burned across commercial streets that local residents depended on for food, medicine, employment, and services. The violence was shocking, but it did not come from nowhere. The official commission appointed afterward, led by former Central Intelligence Agency Director John McCone, identified unemployment, poor education, inadequate housing, and resentment of the police among the central conditions behind the uprising. The report also recommended job creation, improved schools, better public transportation, and changes in police-community relations. Some reforms followed. Many did not. This pattern would become familiar in Los Angeles. A crisis would produce a commission. The commission would identify long-standing conditions. Public attention would remain intense for a period. Funding would be announced, programs would begin, and then the larger city would lose interest before the underlying problems were resolved. For a child growing up in Watts after 1965, the uprising became part of the neighbourhood's memory. Adults remembered the smoke. Business owners remembered losing stores. Residents remembered the National Guard. Police officers remembered being fired upon. Young people heard different explanations depending on who was speaking. Some were told that the uprising had been a rebellion against oppression. Others heard that it was senseless destruction. Many understood it as both. An explosion rooted in real injustice that also harmed the people who lived there. The physical damage could be photographed. The damage to trust was harder to measure. In the years after Watts, political activity increased in many black neighbourhoods. Young organisers demanded community control, better schools, jobs, and protection from police abuse. The Black Panther Party opened a Los Angeles chapter in 1968 under the leadership of Alprentice Bunchy Carter. Carter had once been associated with the Slauson Street Group, one of the best-known black gangs of the earlier era. His movement from gang leadership into political organisation showed that neighbourhood authority could be redirected. Carter and others recruited young men who already understood loyalty, discipline, and the importance of local reputation. Political groups could take skills developed in street organisations and turn them toward community programmes and ideological struggle. This possibility did not last. The Black Panther Party faced intense surveillance and disruption from law enforcement agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO program. Informants entered organisations. Rivalries were encouraged. Leaders were arrested or killed. Internal disagreements also weakened the movement. In January 1969, Bunchy Carter and fellow Panther John Huggins were shot and killed during a meeting at the University of California, Los Angeles, in a conflict involving members of the US organisation, another black nationalist group. The killing removed two important organisers and deepened divisions within black political life in Los Angeles. That same year is commonly associated with the emergence of the Crips. The timing is significant, though it should not be turned into a simple story in which political groups disappeared one day and gangs replaced them the next. The transition was uneven. Churches, civil rights groups, neighbourhood organisations and political activists continued working. Many young people never joined gangs. Many who did join moved in and out of street life. Still, something had changed. The strongest political organisations had been weakened. The institutions that might have absorbed the energy of angry teenagers had fewer resources and faced constant pressure. At the same time, neighbourhood conditions were not improving fast enough to convince young people that conventional paths would reward them. Raymond Washington was a teenager in South Los Angeles during this period. Accounts of the Crips' beginning differ in their details, but most place Washington near the centre of the group's formation around 1969. Stanley Tookie Williams later became another important figure in the expansion of Crip identity on the west side of South Central. The early Crips were not a national criminal organisation. They were young men connected to local neighbourhoods. They wanted recognition, control, and protection. Their reputation grew through confrontation. Smaller groups could join, adopt the name, or create their own Crip set. The name spread because it was useful. A teenager who said he was a Crip was claiming more than friendship with a few boys on his street. He was claiming connection to a feared identity. That reputation could discourage attack, attract new members, and give a local group importance beyond its immediate neighbourhood. It also created enemies. Existing gangs did not disappear simply because the Crips were expanding. Groups such as the Brims, Pyrrhus, Bishops, and others resisted Crip pressure. Some eventually aligned under the identity that became known as the Bloods. The development was gradual, and local histories varied, but the broader pattern was clear. As Crip sets multiplied, non-Crip groups found value in cooperating against them. OJP summaries place the early Crips around 1969 and describe the Blood Alliance emerging during the 1970s among groups including the Pyrrhus and Brims. South Central was now developing a new system of affiliation. A neighbourhood group no longer needed to exist only under its own local name. It could attach itself to a larger identity while maintaining its own leadership and territory. This made gang culture easier to reproduce. A group of teenagers did not need to invent traditions from nothing. They could copy colours, language, hand signs, and rivalries. They could become part of a larger conflict even when they had never met the people who began it. By the early 1970s, Crip-named groups were appearing across South Los Angeles. Blood-affiliated groups followed. Research on Los Angeles gang territory found 18 black gang territories in 1972. The number would increase dramatically over the following decades as sets formed, divided, and claimed smaller areas. Fragmentation was one of the most dangerous features of this growth. The public often imagined one Crip organisation fighting one Blood organisation. In reality, there were separate sets with local leaders and separate disputes. Crips sometimes fought Crips. Bloods sometimes fought Bloods. A peace agreement involving one set did not automatically bind another. Arresting one leader did not dismantle the wider structure because there was no single command structure to dismantle. The gang spread through imitation, family ties, school connections, incarceration, and neighbourhood pressure. A boy's older brother might belong to a set. His cousins might belong. His school might sit inside territory associated with one side. He might be attacked because people assumed he belonged, even if he did not. After that attack, joining could seem less like choosing danger and more like obtaining protection from danger that had already arrived. The economic environment was also beginning to shift. Los Angeles still had manufacturing, transportation, construction, and industrial employment. But many of the stable jobs that had supported working-class families were beginning to decline or move. Automation reduced the number of workers needed, factories relocated, employers moved production outside the city or outside the country. Unionized industrial positions became harder to obtain. The change did not happen at once. A father might still work at a tire plant while his son discovered that the plant was no longer hiring. An uncle might have built a stable life through aerospace employment, while a nephew with a similar education found only temporary service work. This produced a quiet generational break. Adults could advise teenagers to work hard and find a job because that path had worked for them. Teenagers could look around and see that the available jobs paid less, offered fewer hours, and provided little security. The authority of the older generation weakened when its advice no longer matched the economy. Schools carried more of the pressure. They were expected to educate children dealing with poverty, unstable housing, neighbourhood conflict and family stress. Teachers tried to maintain order while resources remained uneven. Students from rival areas met in hallways and schoolyards. A conflict that began in the neighbourhood could continue at school. A fight at school could return to the neighbourhood with more participants. Police responded to rising gang activity with specialised enforcement. The LAPD formed gang units and developed intelligence on local groups. Officers learned names, territories, tattoos and associations. The intention was to identify serious offenders and prevent violence. Residents often experienced these operations more broadly. Young men could be stopped because of where they were standing, who they were with, or what they were wearing. Police photographs and field interview cards recorded associations that might later be used as evidence of gang involvement. Someone with no formal membership could be classified through repeated contact with officers. For police, gathering information was necessary because gang structures were informal. For residents, it could appear that the department had decided an entire generation was suspect. The gap between those views continued to widen. As the decade advanced, violence became more frequent. Territorial disputes hardened. Guns appeared more often. Homicides involving gangs rose. The street group that had once been held together by parties, sports and neighbourhood pride increasingly became defined by its enemies. Fear began to organise daily behaviour. Parents imposed earlier curfews. Teenagers travelled in groups. Families moved when they could. Those with enough money often left for other parts of Los Angeles County, including areas such as Compton, Inglewood, Carson, and neighbourhoods farther east or west. But movement did not always provide escape. Gang affiliations travelled with families. New sets formed in the places where young people relocated. The departure of middle-class families also removed resources from the neighbourhoods they left. Homeowners, business operators, teachers, and public employees often carried political influence and economic stability. Their departure did not cause gang violence, and many remained connected to South Central. But the loss of households with greater financial flexibility weakened communities already dealing with disinvestment. New immigrants were also entering Los Angeles, especially from Mexico and Central America. South Central was never socially frozen. Its population was changing, and Black and Latino residents increasingly lived near one another, attended the same schools, and competed for some of the same low-wage jobs and limited housing. These relationships included friendship, marriage, business, political cooperation, tension, and conflict. Later accounts sometimes reduced the area to a simple racial division, but daily life was more complicated. People shared apartment buildings, workplaces, buses, churches, and commercial streets. By the end of the 1970s, South Central was neither the stable industrial community many migrants had hoped to build, nor the fully devastated landscape later television images would suggest. It was in transition. The factories had not all closed, but the direction was troubling. Political organisations had not disappeared, but many had been weakened. Neighbourhood gangs had existed for decades, but the Crip and Blood identities were changing their scale. Police were attempting to control violence, but their methods deepened resentment among many residents. Most families still lived ordinary lives, but the number of streets shaped by territorial fear was growing. A person could feel the change without seeing the future clearly. The warning signs appeared in small ways. A school dance ended early because two groups arrived. A family stopped visiting relatives after dark. A corner store installed thicker glass. A teenager returned home with a new nickname. A mother discovered a coloured bandana hidden in a drawer. A police cruiser slowed whenever several boys stood together. A funeral brought young men from different blocks into the same room where grief and anger mixed together. Each event could be treated as temporary. Together they formed a pattern. In 1977, Los Angeles County recorded 168 gang-related homicides. By 1980, The number had risen to 351. The increase was already severe, yet the city had not reached the period most people remember as the height of the crisis. The crack cocaine market had not fully arrived. The profits that would allow street dealers to purchase more powerful weapons were not yet circulating at their later scale. The competition for drug-selling locations had not merged completely with the older territorial rivalries. The streets were under pressure, but the largest source of acceleration was still approaching. When crack appeared in the first half of the 1980s, it entered neighbourhoods where the divisions were already established. It found young men who already understood territory, loyalty, retaliation, and neighbourhood reputation. It found a labour force facing shrinking legitimate opportunity. It found residents who distrusted the police and police officers who distrusted residents. It found gangs divided into many local sets, each capable of acting independently. The drug did not need to create a new structure. It only needed to supply money to the structure that was already there. That is what made the next change so destructive. A rivalry that had once been fought over reputation could now involve thousands of dollars. A street corner could become a place of business. A teenager could earn in one evening what an exhausted parent earned in a week. A handgun could be replaced with a semi-automatic weapon. A local dispute could be financed by a market that operated every hour of every day. South Central entered the 1980s carrying the unresolved history of housing segregation, industrial decline, political disruption, police hostility, and territorial conflict. Then the money arrived. A neighbourhood border does not need a wall. It does not need a checkpoint, a fence, or a sign telling you that you have crossed from one place into another. In South Central Los Angeles during the 1970s and 1980s, a border could be an avenue, a set of railroad tracks, a schoolyard, a housing project, or a row of houses that looked no different from the row behind it. To an outsider, the streets appeared connected. The same buses travelled through them. The same utility poles stood over them. Children from both sides might shop at the same stores or attend the same schools. To the young people who lived there, those streets could belong to entirely different worlds. Knowing where one neighbourhood ended and another began became a practical skill. A teenager might know that walking 2 blocks west was safe during the afternoon but dangerous after dark. He might know that a certain convenience store stood inside the territory of a rival group, even though it was the closest place to buy milk. He might understand that the shortest route home was not always the safest one. These rules were rarely written down. They were learned through warnings, rumours, fights, funerals, and experience. An older brother might tell a younger one never to cross a particular boulevard alone. A mother might forbid her son from visiting a friend who lived only a few streets away. Students might know that leaving school through one gate could bring them into contact with people from a hostile neighbourhood. The geography was ordinary. The meaning attached to it was not. The development of these borders began before the Crips and Bloods became the dominant names in black gang life. Earlier youth groups in Los Angeles had already identified themselves with neighbourhoods, housing projects, schools and social clubs. During the 1950s and 1960s, groups formed around house parties, car clubs, dances, roller skating locations and local friendships. Some fought with rivals from nearby areas. Smaller groups sometimes joined together when they felt threatened by larger ones. Territory mattered because territory was familiar. It contained the people a teenager knew, the places where he felt recognised, and the streets where his family lived. Defending the neighbourhood could therefore be presented as defending something personal. It was not described only as criminal control, it could be described as loyalty. That language made the gang easier to accept. A young person might reject the idea that he was joining a criminal organisation. He might say he was representing his block. He was standing with friends. He was protecting himself from young men who came into the neighbourhood looking for trouble. The rival group used the same explanation. Each side saw itself as responding to the aggression of the other. That is one reason territorial violence could continue for years, without either side believing it had started the conflict. The emergence of the Crips changed the scale of these local rivalries. Raymond Washington is generally identified as a central figure in the early formation of the Crips around 1969. Stanley Tookie Williams became associated with their expansion on the west side of South Central. The details of the organisation's earliest years vary between accounts, but the larger pattern is clear. Crip groups appeared in several neighbourhoods, and the name gained power through rapid growth and a reputation for intimidation. The Crips were not one tightly controlled organisation. There was no single headquarters managing every neighbourhood set. A local group might adopt the Crip identity while continuing to operate independently. It could choose its own members, defend its own territory, and pursue its own disputes. This loose structure allowed the name to spread quickly. A centralised organisation must approve new branches, select leaders, and maintain communication. A street identity can travel through imitation. Young people hear the name, they see the reputation attached to it. They add the name to an existing group or form a new one. The larger identity gives the local group recognition. The local group gives the larger identity another territory. By the early 1970s, groups using Crip names appeared across South Los Angeles. Some were connected through friendships or shared enemies. Others had little contact with one another beyond the name. As the number of sets increased, the meaning of being a Crip became less about membership in a single organisation and more about belonging to a broad association of neighbourhood gangs sharing parts of a common culture. That culture included language, clothing, graffiti, signs, and enemies. The colour blue became strongly associated with Crip identity, although colours were not worn as uniforms every day and could vary by time and neighbourhood. The letter C could appear in names and graffiti. Hand signs identified local sets. Nicknames communicated affiliation to people who understood them. These symbols served a practical purpose. A young person could announce where he belonged without explaining his history. A wall marked with a set's name informed residents and rivals that the group claimed influence there. A sign made with the hands could establish identity across a crowded schoolyard or from the window of a passing car. The same symbols could also place someone in danger. A colour that appeared harmless to one person could be interpreted as a challenge by another. A baseball cap could display a letter associated with a neighbourhood. A teenager who had no gang affiliation might be questioned because of his clothing, where he lived, or who stood beside him. Misunderstanding became part of the risk. The growth of the Crips placed pressure on existing neighbourhood groups. Some groups were absorbed, some adopted Crip names voluntarily. Others resisted because they wanted to preserve their own identity, or because they had already fought with nearby Crips. Groups including the Pyrrhus and Brims became part of the loose alignment that developed into the Bloods. The Blood identity offered smaller, non-Crip gangs a way to cooperate against a more numerous rival. It did not erase their individual names. A person could belong to a specific Piru or Blood set, while also participating in the larger Crip Blood division. Red became associated with Blood identity in the same way blue became associated with the Crips. The colours made the conflict easier to recognise from a distance, but they could create the false impression that every Crip was connected to every other Crip, and every Blood followed the same leadership. In reality, loyalty was usually local. The set came first. A Crip set might consider another Crip set an enemy because of a murder, insult, robbery, or territorial dispute. Blood sets could fight other blood sets for the same reasons. Larger labels did not eliminate older rivalries or prevent new ones. This fragmentation made the violence difficult to control. A truce arranged between two respected leaders could calm one dispute while another continued only a mile away. A promise made by older members might be ignored by younger ones seeking status. A peace meeting could reduce shootings between two sets, but have no effect on their allies. There was no single person capable of ordering all Crips or all Bloods to stop. There was also no central authority deciding exactly where each territory began. Borders formed through use and challenge. a group gathered regularly around a park, apartment building or intersection. Its name appeared on walls. Members confronted unfamiliar young men. Rivals tested the claim by entering the area, crossing out graffiti, or attacking someone associated with the neighbourhood. If the group defended the area successfully, the claim became stronger. If it failed, a rival might expand. Graffiti became one of the clearest records of these territorial contests. A gang name written on a wall could function as an announcement of presence. Adding the names of members could memorialise the group. Writing insults against a rival could invite confrontation. Crossing out another group's name carried particular meaning. It was not merely damage to paint. It could be treated as a public statement that the rival had no authority there. Because the insult remained visible, it demanded a response from anyone concerned with reputation. Research into black gang territoriality in Los Angeles later found that the most hostile graffiti often appeared near boundaries. It also found that homicides did not always concentrate directly on those borderlines, which is a useful reminder that a gang map should not be understood like a military map. Violence could occur at parties, schools, parks, stores, homes, or anywhere rivals encountered one another. The number of identified black gang territories grew from 18 in 1972 to 274 by 1996, covering more than 62 square miles. That growth did not mean every inch of those 62 square miles was controlled every hour of the day. Gang territory was often an area of influence rather than complete government. Residents continued to own homes, operate businesses, attend churches, and organise community life. Most people living inside a claimed territory were not gang members. The gang did not necessarily control who entered during the morning or whether a delivery driver could use the street. Its influence became most visible in particular situations, when groups gathered outside, when rivals appeared, when drugs were sold, when parties were held, or when someone was accused of disrespect. Control also varied from block to block. One intersection might be closely watched because members gathered there. Another street inside the same territory might remain relatively quiet. An apartment complex could serve as the centre of a set's social life, while homeowners only a few blocks away had little direct contact with members. The boundaries were real without being complete. That made them difficult for outsiders to understand. A police map could draw a clean line around a territory. Daily life rarely followed such clean lines. Members had relatives in rival areas. Children from different neighbourhoods attended the same schools. People moved between parents' homes after divorce. A family might leave one housing project and settle in an area associated with another set. The city forced people together even when gang rules pushed them apart. Public schools were among the most important places where these competing geographies collided. A school attendance zone could bring students from several neighbourhoods into one building. Some arrived with inherited rivalries. Others became involved after being attacked, threatened, or pressured to choose a side. The school day did not remove territorial identity. It concentrated it. A student might spend the morning in class beside someone whose neighbourhood he avoided after dark. A dispute in the cafeteria could draw in friends from several sets. Dismissal could become the most dangerous part of the day because students left in groups and carried school conflicts back toward their neighbourhoods. Teachers and administrators tried suspensions, transfers, security patrols, and separate release times. These measures could reduce immediate conflict without changing the conditions outside the school. Expulsion created another problem. A teenager, removed from school, spent more time on the street. He lost daily contact with teachers, coaches, and students outside his immediate neighbourhood. A punishment intended to protect the school could increase his dependence on the gang. Housing projects created a similar concentration. Places such as Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, and Imperial Courts had strong local identities long before the worst years of gang violence. Residents formed friendships, watched one another's children, and built community organisations. The physical design of the projects also created courtyards, walkways, and common areas where young people spent time together. These spaces could support community life. They could also become centres of territorial organisation. A project had clear physical edges. Residents knew who lived there and who did not. Young people from outside could be identified quickly. Once a gang became closely associated with a project, the name of the place and the name of the set could become difficult to separate in public discussion. The residents then paid for an identity most of them had not chosen. A job applicant could be judged by an address. A child could be treated as a gang member because of where he lived. Police entering the development could view ordinary groups of teenagers as possible suspects. Rivals could shoot into an area without knowing who they were hitting. Territorial identity spread through families as well as streets. Gang members were not strangers appearing from outside the community. They were sons, brothers, cousins, classmates, neighbours, and sometimes fathers. A family could oppose gang activity while loving someone involved in it. That contradiction shaped many households. A mother might order her son to stop spending time with the set while allowing his friends into the home because she had known them since they were children. A grandmother might condemn a shooting while hiding her grandson from people seeking revenge. An older brother might tell a younger child to stay out of the gang but still expect him to defend the family name. The same network that recruited members could also provide care. Gang associates might collect money for a funeral. They might protect a neighbour from robbery, help a family move furniture, or buy groceries for someone in need. These actions did not cancel the violence, but they made the gang's place in the community more complicated than an outside description could show. A group capable of frightening one resident could make another feel protected. That sense of protection was often temporary. Joining a set could reduce the fear of standing alone, but it created new enemies. A teenager who had previously been unknown outside his block could become a target because of the name he claimed. Protection therefore produced exposure. The more closely someone identified with a gang, the more seriously rivals treated him. A young member seeking respect might volunteer for dangerous acts because older members were watching. The act increased his reputation inside the set while increasing the likelihood that someone would attack him later. Reputation operated like a form of local currency. A person gained it by appearing fearless, responding to insults, fighting rivals, carrying weapons, or committing violence. Once acquired, reputation could discourage some attacks. It could also attract challenges from people trying to build their own names. Appearing weak was dangerous. Appearing powerful could be just as dangerous. The question, "Where are you from?" became one of the most important and threatening sentences in this environment. In another setting, it might be casual conversation. On a Los Angeles street, it could be an identification test. The person asking was not always requesting a birthplace. He wanted to know what neighbourhood, set, or side the other person represented. A truthful answer could begin a fight. The wrong answer could be considered disrespect. Refusing to answer might also be treated as suspicious. Someone with no gang affiliation could still be trapped by the question. Saying nowhere did not guarantee safety if he lived in a neighbourhood associated with a rival. His address, school, relatives, or clothing might already have answered for him. As these confrontations became more common, residents adjusted their movements. Parents drove children short distances rather than allowing them to walk. Teenagers avoided certain bus stops. Friends met at neutral locations. Families checked who was attending a party before allowing a child to go. Neutrality became hard to maintain. A shop owner might serve everyone but still be accused of allowing one set to gather outside. A school might be officially neutral but stand inside a claimed territory. A park could be public property and still become unusable to young people from the wrong neighbourhood. Even funerals could become territorial events. The death of a member brought grief, anger, and a large gathering of people connected to the set. Rivals knew where and when mourners would meet. Police feared retaliation. Families had to consider whether the service itself might be attacked. A funeral could also recruit new members. A child seeing a church filled with people honouring an older boy might understand the gang as a source of importance. The deceased was remembered by a street name. His photograph appeared on shirts and walls. Friends promised that he would not be forgotten. The grief was sincere. So was the pressure to retaliate. Retaliation transformed borders from social divisions into repeated sources of death. Imagine that a member of one set is shot while walking through another neighbourhood. His friends believe they know who did it, though their information may come from rumour. They drive into the rival area and shoot someone associated with that set. The second victim may not have been involved in the original attack. His friends now want revenge. Each side counts its own dead and treats the other side's deaths as justified responses. The original incident becomes buried beneath later shootings. Younger members inherit the conflict without knowing the names of the first people involved. By then, the rivalry no longer needs a clear cause. The deaths are the cause. Police intervention sometimes interrupted these cycles by arresting suspected shooters. It could also deepen territorial identity. Specialised gang officers recorded names, nicknames, relationships, graffiti and locations. They learned which set claimed which streets, and who was associated with whom. From a law enforcement perspective, this information was necessary. The gangs lacked formal membership lists and often had no clear hierarchy. Investigators needed to understand local relationships to solve crimes and anticipate retaliation. Residents saw another side. Young men could be stopped and questioned repeatedly because they lived in a gang-affected area. Being photographed with known members could contribute to police suspicion. Standing outside with cousins or childhood friends could be recorded as gang association. This practice could turn geography into evidence. Where a person lived, where he spent time, and whom he knew became part of how police defined him. That definition sometimes followed people even after they tried to leave street life. Arrests and imprisonment carried territorial identities into county jails and state prisons. Inside those institutions, affiliation could become necessary for safety. People were classified, housed, and understood through gang associations. Conflicts from the street entered jail and relationships formed in custody returned to neighbourhoods when people were released. Prison did not simply remove individuals from the territorial system, it could strengthen the system. Experienced members returned with new connections, new status, and sometimes greater commitment to gang identity. Younger people saw incarceration as evidence that someone had endured a serious test. Time in custody could damage employment prospects, making street networks more important after release. As the 1970s ended, the number of Crip and Blood sets continued to increase. New groups formed through division, as well as expansion. A disagreement inside one set could produce another set with its own name and territory. A group of younger members might claim several blocks under a new identity. Family movement carried affiliations into new communities. Every division created another potential border. The Los Angeles street system helped those identities spread. The city was built around long boulevards, freeways, rail lines, industrial zones, and separated residential areas. These features created obvious markers people could use to describe territory. One set might claim everything between two major avenues. Another might identify itself with a numbered street. A freeway could separate one neighbourhood from another. A housing project could define the centre of a set's identity. The map became increasingly detailed, but the people living inside it still had to go to work, attend school, buy food, and visit relatives. Most residents could not simply obey every gang boundary. A bus route crossed several territories. A hospital might stand in a rival area. A child's grandmother might live on the other side of a long-running dispute. Daily life required movement through a city that gang culture was attempting to divide. This is where the phrase gang territory can become misleading. The territory did not belong legally to the gang. It belonged to homeowners, tenants, businesses, public agencies, and the city. Gang members were a small percentage of the population, yet a small number of armed people could change how thousands behaved. They did not need to control every resident. They only needed to make the possible cost of ignoring them high enough. By the early 1980s, the borders were well established in many neighbourhoods. Children were growing up with the names of sets as part of their understanding of the city. Teenagers inherited alliances from older siblings. Police had developed maps and files. Graffiti announced claims. Funerals preserved memories. Retaliation gave old disputes new energy. Then the economic purpose of territory began to change. A neighbourhood had once been defended mainly for identity, protection, and reputation. Drug sales added another reason. A particular corner could provide customers. An apartment could store narcotics or money. A block could become valuable because buyers knew where to find a seller. Territory was becoming a market. The Crips and Bloods did not stop fighting over neighbourhood identity when crack cocaine arrived. The drug economy attached profit to rivalries that already existed. It gave young men cash, created new disputes over selling locations, and made firearms easier to purchase. The borders did not disappear. They became more expensive to cross. Crack cocaine did not create gang violence in Los Angeles. The territorial rivalries were already there. Young men had already been killed over neighbourhood identity, personal disputes, insults, and retaliation. Crip and Blood sets had already divided into smaller groups with separate enemies. Police had already developed specialised gang units, and residents had already learned that a shooting in one neighbourhood could produce another shooting somewhere else, days or weeks later. What crack changed was the amount of money moving through the streets, the speed at which it moved, and the number of people willing to fight for access to it. During the first half of the 1980s, a new form of cocaine became increasingly visible in Los Angeles. Powder cocaine had been used for years, especially among wealthier customers who could afford it. Crack was different. Dealers processed powder cocaine into small, smokable pieces that could be sold individually at a relatively low price. A customer did not need enough money to purchase a full quantity of powder. A small rock could be bought quickly, smoked quickly, and followed by another purchase soon afterward. The intense but short-lived effect helped produce repeated demand. For sellers, that meant customers might return several times in one evening. A residential street could become a marketplace almost overnight. At first, the change was easy to miss. A few unfamiliar cars began stopping near an apartment building. People approached the windows, exchanged something, and stepped away. A house that had once been quiet received visitors at every hour. A corner where teenagers had gathered socially became a place where money changed hands. The activity did not require a large store, a warehouse, or an obvious criminal headquarters. Sales could take place from a doorway, an alley, a parked car, or a small group standing near a sidewalk. That made the market flexible. It also placed the market directly inside ordinary neighbourhood life. A resident walking to a bus stop passed sellers and customers. Children returning from school saw exchanges taking place. Families living beside a sales location heard arguments, car doors, police sirens, and people knocking at the wrong apartment after dark. The drug trade did not take over every block, but where it became established, it changed the use of public space. A street corner was no longer only a place to meet friends, it could produce income. A parking lot was no longer only a place for residents' cars, it could become a meeting point between sellers and buyers. Territory now had a direct financial value. That did not mean every Crip or Blood set immediately became an organised drug company. Research using Los Angeles law enforcement records from 1983 through 1985 found that cocaine sales arrests increased by 375% during those years, but the early expansion of crack sales was not dominated by street gangs. Researchers concluded that regular drug dealers, rather than gangs as unified organisations, controlled much of the initial crack market. Gang members became involved, sometimes heavily, but the relationship between gangs, drugs and violence was less direct than public accounts often suggested. This distinction matters. A gang member who sold crack was not necessarily selling on behalf of the entire set. He might be operating for himself, with relatives, or with a small group of friends. The gang could provide contacts, protection and access to a neighbourhood without functioning as one coordinated business. A set might contain several sellers who cooperated in some situations and competed in others. Older members might oppose drug sales near their own homes while accepting profits from sales elsewhere. Some members did not sell drugs at all. Others entered the market because it offered the fastest income available to them. The street economy was informal, fragmented and unstable. That instability increased the danger. A legitimate business has written contracts, courts, insurance and banking systems. An illegal drug market has none of those protections. A seller who is robbed cannot report the missing inventory to the police. A supplier who is not paid cannot file a lawsuit. A dispute over money is settled through threats, assault, exclusion or murder. Violence becomes a form of enforcement. Reputation becomes a form of credit. Fear becomes a form of security. Someone believed to be weak may be robbed repeatedly. Someone known to retaliate may discourage future attacks. Carrying a firearm can therefore appear reasonable to a person operating in that market, even when the decision makes every later confrontation more likely to become deadly. The money encouraged young people to accept that risk. By the early 1980s, many working-class communities in South Los Angeles were dealing with the long decline of industrial employment. Manufacturing plants had closed, reduced their workforces, or moved production elsewhere. Stable jobs that had once provided wages to people without college degrees became harder to find. The available alternatives were often temporary, poorly paid, or located far from the neighbourhoods where workers lived. A teenager could watch an adult leave home before sunrise, travel across the city, work an entire day, and return with little money left after rent, food, and transportation. The same teenager could see someone only a few years older carrying cash, wearing new clothes, driving a car, and receiving attention from people on the street. The illegal income was dangerous and unreliable, but it was visible. The legitimate path required patience without guaranteeing success. That contrast gave crack sales much of their recruiting power. Most young people in South Central did not become dealers. Most continued attending school, working ordinary jobs, helping their families, and avoiding gangs. It is important not to mistake the people who became most visible for the population as a whole. Still, a relatively small number of active sellers could alter the life of an entire block. One dealer needed customers. Customers attracted other sellers. Sellers attracted robbers. Robberies encouraged weapons. Weapons increased the chance that an argument, mistaken identity, or sudden movement would end in gunfire. The money also changed relationships inside gangs. Before the crack market expanded, status usually came from neighbourhood reputation, fighting ability, age, family connections, and willingness to confront rivals. Drug profits created another path to influence. A young seller with cash could purchase cars, clothing, weapons, and loyalty. He could pay bail, help with funerals, support friends in prison, and provide money to families. Economic power could challenge traditional authority. An older member might have years of respect but little money. A younger dealer might have no seniority but control a profitable sales location. The older man could expect obedience based on history. The younger one could attract followers by paying them. The result was not always a more organised gang. It could produce more fragmentation. Small groups formed around particular sellers. Personal business disputes became connected to neighbourhood rivalries. Someone robbed during a drug transaction might seek help from his set, turning an individual conflict into a gang conflict. A shooting that appeared territorial from the outside might actually involve debt, theft, jealousy, or competition between dealers from the same side. The categories began to overlap. Gang violence could involve drugs. Drug violence could involve gang members. But neither fact meant that every gang homicide was a fight over crack. Studies of Los Angeles homicides between 1986 and 1988 found that gang-motivated killings were actually less likely than other homicides to involve narcotics, while narcotics-motivated killings were less likely to involve gang members. The evidence did not support the claim that most gang homicides were simply battles over drug trafficking. The drug market intensified an existing environment rather than replacing it. A person could still be killed over a decades-old rivalry between neighbourhoods. A teenager could still be shot because someone believed he belonged to the wrong set. An insult at a party could still lead to retaliation. The presence of crack added more weapons, more money, more strangers, and more reasons for people to be outside at dangerous hours. It also made the violence more difficult for residents to interpret. A mother might hear that her son was killed because he belonged to a gang. His friends might insist that he was attacked over a personal dispute. Police might classify the death as gang-related because of the people involved. Rumours might connect it to a drug debt. The actual reason could remain unclear even to those closest to him. Uncertainty did not prevent retaliation. People acted on what they believed had happened. A rumour could be enough. Firearms determined how deadly those beliefs became. Guns were already widely used in Los Angeles homicides before crack appeared. During the 1970s, 56.6% of the city's criminal homicides involved firearms, and handguns accounted for most of those gun killings. The homicide rate increased from 12.5 per 100,000 residents in 1970 to 23 per 100,000 in 1979. The 1980s did not introduce guns to the city. The decade changed how many guns circulated in certain neighbourhoods, what kinds of weapons people sought, and how routinely teenagers expected rivals to be armed. A revolver required the shooter to fire a limited number of rounds before reloading. Semi-automatic pistols could hold more ammunition and be reloaded quickly with a magazine. Some attackers used shotguns, rifles, or military-style semi-automatic weapons. The exact weapon varied, but the expectation of increased firepower affected behaviour even when the weapon itself was not present. A young man who believed his rivals carried semi-automatic pistols was unlikely to feel safe carrying nothing. His rivals made the same calculation. Each side described its weapon as protection from the other. The result was an arms race conducted by teenagers and young adults in residential neighbourhoods. Many of the people carrying guns had little formal training. They fired while frightened, angry, intoxicated, running, or leaning from moving cars. Some weapons were stolen, others changed hands repeatedly. A gun could be loaned to a friend and later used in a shooting that brought retaliation against everyone associated with the owner. The availability of firearms did not only increase the number of deaths, it increased distance between attacker and victim. Earlier street conflicts often required people to approach one another. They might argue, fight, or use knives and clubs. Firearms allowed someone to attack from across a street or from inside a vehicle. The car became central to gang violence. Los Angeles was built around automobiles. Wide streets, long blocks, and extensive freeways made cars essential to daily life. The same geography that allowed workers to travel across the city allowed attackers to enter a rival neighbourhood, fire and escape quickly. Drive-by shootings were not invented during the crack era, but they became more common and more feared. A moving car gave the attacker concealment, transportation and distance. It also reduced accuracy. Bullets fired from a vehicle could strike anyone nearby. The intended target might escape while a child, neighbour or passing driver was hit. Police research comparing gang and non-gang violence in Los Angeles found that gang incidents were more likely to occur in public places, involve cars and firearms, include more participants, and produce additional injuries. Suspects were also more likely to be unknown to victims, while witnesses often feared retaliation. Those characteristics made each case difficult to investigate. A shooting might last only seconds. The vehicle disappeared. Witnesses saw darkness, movement and muzzle flashes rather than faces. People who recognised the car or occupants had to decide whether speaking to police was worth the risk. The police might not be able to protect a witness after the interview ended. The gang could remain in the neighbourhood. Silence was therefore not always approval. It could be survival. Residents lived between the need to stop the violence and the fear that cooperation would make them targets. Some called police anonymously. Some passed information through ministers or community activists. Others refused to speak even when they knew exactly what had happened. Investigators interpreted this silence as hostility or protection of criminals. Residents saw it as evidence that police did not understand the danger of returning home after giving a statement. The relationship became more strained as enforcement increased. Police officers entering an active drug market faced people carrying firearms, sellers who could flee through alleys, and crowds that warned one another when patrol cars approached. Officers also knew that routine stops could become violent without warning. These dangers encouraged aggressive tactics. Officers stopped groups of young men, searched vehicles, entered suspected sales locations, and recorded information about gang associations. Specialised units treated certain blocks as areas requiring constant pressure. For residents, the pressure often felt indiscriminate. A person did not need to sell drugs to be stopped near a drug location. He only needed to live nearby. Young men returning from school or work could be placed against walls while officers searched them. Families watched police enter homes based on information that was not always accurate. Children saw neighbours handcuffed on sidewalks. The distinction between enforcement and occupation became difficult to maintain. Drug sellers used this resentment to their advantage. They warned residents that police viewed everyone in the neighbourhood as guilty. Each abusive stop made that argument more convincing. Police officers then encountered more hostility and less cooperation, which made them more suspicious. Both sides entered each encounter expecting the worst. The crack market also affected the physical condition of neighbourhoods. Addiction consumed household income. Rent went unpaid. Utilities were disconnected. Property was stolen and sold. Families took in children whose parents could no longer care for them. Grandmothers and older relatives became responsible for another generation. Some users disappeared for days. Others remained physically present but became unreliable, spending money intended for food or bills. Parents lost custody. Couples separated. Small arguments became violent when withdrawal, intoxication, fear, and financial pressure combined. The public discussion often treated users as moral failures. That response made it easier to ignore the families carrying the consequences. A grandmother raising 3 grandchildren did not appear in arrest statistics. A child waiting for a parent who never returned was not visible in a police seizure photograph. A tenant living beside a heavily used apartment had no simple way to remove the activity without placing herself in danger. Residents organised against the trade. Community groups marched near sales locations. Parents demanded that schools and parks be protected. Ministers held meetings. Neighbours contacted city officials and asked for buildings to be closed. Some residents confronted dealers directly. These efforts received less national attention than raids and shootings. The image of South Central became increasingly defined by its worst moments. Television crews arrived after gunfire, arrests and fires. A quiet block rarely appeared on the evening news. A successful youth program did not produce dramatic footage. A family that kept its children safe through years of pressure did not become a headline. The public, therefore, saw violence without seeing resistance. That incomplete picture influenced policy. The federal and state response to crack emphasised punishment. New laws imposed severe penalties for possession and distribution. Police departments received greater resources for drug enforcement. Prosecutors used conspiracy and enterprise laws to pursue groups involved in trafficking. Some serious offenders were removed from the streets. The market remained. Demand continued, and arrest created vacancies. A seller sent to prison could be replaced by someone younger. The new person might have less experience, less authority, and more reason to prove himself. High turnover made the street economy less stable. It also placed more young men inside jails and prisons, where gang affiliations could become stronger. Someone who had sold drugs independently might enter custody and discover that survival required association with a racial or neighbourhood group. He returned home with new relationships and a record that reduced his employment options. Enforcement could therefore disrupt one drug operation while strengthening the social networks that supported another. The profits also helped Crip and Blood identities spread beyond Los Angeles. Members and associates travelled to other cities for family reasons, business or drug sales. Local groups elsewhere adopted Los Angeles names and symbols. Some had direct connections to California. Others copied what they had heard through music, prison, news coverage, and personal contact. This did not create one national Crip or Blood organisation. It produced local versions of a recognisable identity. The media often describe this expansion as a coordinated invasion, suggesting that Los Angeles gangs were sending organised teams across the country under central command. Some individuals did travel to establish drug connections, but imitation and independent adoption were also important. The same loose structure that allowed gang identities to spread across South Los Angeles allowed them to spread nationally without a single leadership directing the process. Inside Los Angeles, the violence continued to follow local patterns. One set fought another over a killing, a dealer was robbed, a party was interrupted, a car entered the wrong neighbourhood. Someone crossed out a name on a wall. The presence of drug money made each event more dangerous, but the emotional logic remained familiar. Respect had to be defended. Loss required an answer. Fear could not be admitted. Weapons had to be carried because everyone else was believed to be carrying them. The consequences spread far beyond active participants. An ambulance crew responding to a shooting had to consider whether the attackers might return. Emergency rooms treated young victims while relatives and friends gathered outside. Schools dealt with empty desks and students unable to concentrate after funerals. Businesses closed earlier. Families moved when they could, often carrying trauma and gang affiliations into new communities. Property values declined in areas perceived as dangerous. Insurance became more expensive. Legitimate businesses avoided investment. Fewer jobs meant that illegal income became more attractive, reinforcing the conditions that helped the market survive. The process fed itself. Violence drove away opportunity. The loss of opportunity strengthened the illegal economy. The illegal economy funded weapons. Weapons made violence more lethal. The rising number of deaths created more grief and retaliation. By the late 1980s, firearms were producing increasing numbers of deaths among adolescents and young adults across the United States, with firearm-related mortality rising particularly sharply among those age groups. Los Angeles experienced this national trend inside neighborhoods where gang rivalries, crack markets, economic decline and police distrust were already concentrated. It was tempting to identify one cause. Politicians blamed drugs. Police officials blamed gangs. Community activists blamed poverty and racism. Residents blamed dealers, absent services, aggressive officers, irresponsible gun owners, failing schools, and officials who appeared only during elections or crises. Each explanation captured part of the problem. None was enough on its own. Crack cocaine mattered because it created a profitable market that operated in public space and attracted armed competition. Firearms mattered because they allowed impulsive conflicts to kill several people in seconds. Gang rivalries mattered because they provided ready-made enemies and a language of retaliation. Economic decline mattered because it made dangerous income appear reasonable. Segregation mattered because the damage was concentrated in communities with limited political power. Police practices mattered because they weakened cooperation at the moment when investigators most needed witnesses. The crisis was produced by these forces working together. A teenager selling crack on a corner was not thinking about deindustrialization, housing policy, or federal sentencing law. He was thinking about the money in his pocket, the people watching him, and the rival who might arrive in a car. A police officer approaching that corner was not thinking about the history of restrictive covenants. He was thinking about the possibility that someone nearby had a gun. A resident looking through the curtains was not thinking about criminological categories. She was thinking about whether her children were inside. Each person acted within a small immediate reality. Together, those actions created a city-wide emergency. The streets had already become borders. Crack made some of those borders profitable. Firearms made defending them more deadly. Fear kept residents indoors, witnesses silent, young men armed, and police prepared for confrontation. By the end of the decade, the question was no longer whether South Central had a gang problem. The question was how the city would respond to neighbourhoods where ordinary families were living beside open drug markets, retaliatory shootings, and increasingly aggressive police operations. Los Angeles chose force. The largest raids would involve hundreds of officers. Armoured vehicles would enter residential streets. Young men would be stopped in numbers so large that arrests themselves became a public performance. Police leaders argued that these measures were necessary to restore control. Residents would be expected to accept the raids as protection. Many experienced them as another source of danger. For a family living in South Central Los Angeles during the late 1980s, danger did not always arrive in a form that was easy to identify. Sometimes it came in a slow-moving car. Sometimes it came in a police cruiser. The people inside the house might fear both vehicles for different reasons. One could carry young men searching for a rival. The other could carry officers who believed the people standing outside were connected to a gang or drug market. A resident looking through the curtains had only a few seconds to decide whether to remain near the window, move the children away from the front room, or step outside and see what was happening. Most families were not choosing between gangs and the police, as though the two sides offered equal claims on their loyalty. They wanted gang members to stop shooting. They wanted drug sellers away from their doors. They wanted police officers to arrest people who committed murders and robberies. They also wanted their sons to return home without being stopped, searched, struck, or arrested for standing with the wrong group of friends. These wishes should not have contradicted one another. In practice, they often did. The gang violence created immediate fear. Police operations created another kind of uncertainty. A family might call the police after hearing gunfire, and then worry about what would happen when officers arrived. Young men in the neighbourhood could be ordered against walls. Residents might be questioned as though they were suspects. A person who had witnessed the shooting could be exposed in front of neighbours before officers left. The attackers might return later. The police probably would not be there when they did. This was the problem faced by many witnesses. Gang shootings frequently occurred outdoors, involved several participants, used cars and firearms, and left victims who did not personally know every attacker. Investigators studying Los Angeles incidents from 1978 through 1982 found that gang cases were more likely than other violent cases to involve public places, unknown suspects, additional injuries, and fear of retaliation. A witness could therefore possess only part of the information. She may have seen the colour of the car but not the license plate. She may have recognised one passenger but not the shooter. She may have heard a neighbourhood name called out before the gunfire. She may know exactly who was responsible and still decide to say nothing. From outside the neighbourhood, that silence could be interpreted as support for the gang. Police officers and prosecutors often complained that residents demanded protection while refusing to cooperate with investigations. Their frustration was understandable. A homicide case without witnesses, physical evidence, or a known suspect was extremely difficult to solve. The resident faced a different calculation. Giving a statement did not end when the interview ended. She had to remain in the same apartment, use the same bus stop, and send her children to the same school. The people she identified might have relatives and friends living nearby. Even if the accused person went to jail, others could punish her for speaking. Witness intimidation became a serious problem in violent gang prosecutions. Los Angeles prosecutors reported that gang associates sometimes appeared in courtrooms to frighten witnesses. and specialised prosecution programs were developed partly because ordinary case handling did not provide enough time or protection for frightened residents. The safest choice for the wider community was often to help solve the crime. The safest choice for the individual witness could be to remain silent. That conflict left families carrying knowledge they could not safely use. A mother might know who killed her son because his friends had told her. Those same friends might refuse to repeat the name to detectives. They feared being labelled informants, but they also feared creating another death. The mother could demand justice while understanding why the boys were afraid. The police saw an uncooperative neighbourhood. The neighbourhood saw people trying to survive after the officers went home. Inside the house, parents developed rules intended to reduce exposure. Children were expected to come home before dark. Teenagers were told not to stand in large groups, not to argue with strangers, and not to wear clothing that could be mistaken for gang colours. The instructions changed according to the block, the school, and the latest shooting. A route that had been safe last month might no longer be safe after a killing. A friendship could become dangerous because one family moved into another set's territory. A party that seemed harmless could attract people from several rival neighbourhoods. Parents tried to gather information through informal networks. Someone's aunt heard that a shooting was expected after a funeral. A neighbour learned that a particular park should be avoided. A child came home from school with a rumour that two sets planned to fight. The information was often incomplete, but families could not wait for certainty. They made decisions from fragments. A mother might keep her children inside for an entire weekend because she had heard that someone was seeking revenge. The expected attack might never happen. That did not mean the warning was foolish. It meant the family had successfully avoided a danger that could not be measured. This kind of prevention disappeared from official accounts. No report recorded the child who was not shot because his mother refused to let him visit a friend. No statistic counted the birthday party cancelled after a threatening phone call. No newspaper described the thousands of evenings when parents rearranged ordinary life to keep children away from a conflict they had not created. The restrictions accumulated. Children lost access to parks. Teenagers could not attend events in certain neighbourhoods. Older residents stopped sitting outside after dark. Families became more isolated from one another at the moment when community relationships were most needed. The home itself offered only limited safety. Bullets entered houses through walls and windows. A person did not have to be standing outside to become a victim. Families moved beds away from front rooms. Children were taught to fall to the floor when they heard rapid gunfire. Some parents placed heavy furniture against exposed walls, not because it could stop every bullet, but because any additional barrier seemed useful. The sound of a car backfiring could send people downward before they had time to think. The body learned to react before the mind understood what had happened. Afterward, everyone listened. If there were no screams, sirens, or speeding engines, people slowly stood up. Someone checked the windows. A parent counted the children. The household returned to what it had been doing, though the feeling in the room did not return so quickly. Fear became a routine rather than a single event. It affected sleep, concentration, school performance, and health. A child who appeared distracted in class might have spent the night on the floor after shots were fired nearby. A teenager who seemed defiant might be exhausted from watching the street because his family had received a threat. Teachers rarely knew the entire story. Employers did not always understand why a worker arrived late after police sealed off a block. The rest of Los Angeles continued according to schedules that assumed streets were open, buses were running, and homes were quiet enough for sleep. South Central families were expected to maintain those schedules while managing conditions that could change without warning. Gang members were part of these families. That fact complicated every response. The young man selling drugs on the corner was someone's son. The person suspected of a drive-by shooting might share a bedroom with younger brothers. His mother could love him, condemn what he was doing, and fear him at the same time. Parents attempted many forms of intervention. They argued. They threatened to send children away. They asked ministers, coaches, relatives, and older neighbourhood figures to speak with them. Some removed clothing, weapons, or drugs from bedrooms. Some called police. Others refused to call because they believed an arrest would make the situation worse, or expose the family to retaliation. Sending a teenager to live elsewhere sometimes worked. A boy placed with relatives outside Los Angeles could enter a different school, find work, and separate from the set. Others returned quickly. Some discovered that Crip and Blood identities had already spread into the new city. The family could change the address. It could not always remove the relationships, reputation, and conflicts attached to the child. Parents also had to protect younger siblings from the influence of older ones. A little boy might admire the brother everyone in the neighbourhood respected. He saw the clothes, the visitors, and the money. He may not have seen the fear behind the locked bedroom door, or understood why his brother checked every car passing the house. The older brother might tell him never to join. The warning competed with everything the child observed. If gang life was entirely empty, it would have attracted fewer people. It offered friendship, status, excitement, and protection, especially to young people who felt unimportant elsewhere. Gang members paid for funerals, helped families with food, and defended some residents from local criminals. These actions helped create loyalty even as the same groups produced violence. A mother could be grateful when her son's friends collected money for rent. She could also know that the money came from drug sales. A neighbour could appreciate that local members stopped someone from robbing an elderly resident. He could still fear being hit by their bullets during the next conflict. The community's relationship with the gang was not simple approval or rejection. It was shaped by family, dependence, fear, and familiarity. Police officers entered this environment with their own pressures. By 1980, the LAPD reported that street and motorcycle gangs, estimated by the department at roughly 9,000 members, were responsible for nearly 4,000 serious crimes. The department assigned 133 officers full-time to a special gang program, while also reporting a loss of experienced personnel. During the following decade, gang membership, drug markets, and homicide increased. Officers responded to shootings where armed suspects had disappeared into crowds. They entered houses believed to contain drugs and weapons. They stopped vehicles that might have been used in drive-by attacks. Some officers were fired upon. Some were injured. Their fear was also real. An officer approaching a group of teenagers at night could not know immediately who was armed. A hand moving toward a waistband could be an attempt to hide drugs, produce identification, or reach for a gun. Training encouraged officers to control the situation before determining which possibility was correct. That need for control could produce harsh encounters. Young men were ordered to the ground. Residents were handcuffed while officers searched homes. People who questioned police actions could be treated as threats. The department's aggressive culture rewarded officers who made arrests and seized weapons. It did not always reward patience with residents who were angry, frightened, or slow to obey. Many black families had experienced this style of policing for decades. The memory of Watts, earlier brutality complaints, and repeated street stops shaped how they interpreted every new operation. An officer might see a lawful search. The family saw another invasion of its home. The officer might see young men refusing instructions. The young men saw another public humiliation. Neither side began the encounter without history. During the 1970s, the LAPD created specialized anti-gang teams, commonly known as CRASH, for community resources against street hoodlums. The name suggested community protection, but the units became known for intensive surveillance, stops, arrests, and the gathering of gang intelligence. Officers learned neighborhood boundaries, street names, tattoos, alliances, and rivalries. This knowledge helped investigators understand crimes that would otherwise appear unconnected. It also gave the police broad discretion to decide who counted as a gang member or associate. A teenager could be documented because he was stopped with known members. He might live in the same apartment complex, attend the same school, or have relatives in the gang. Once recorded, the association could influence later police encounters. The label could become difficult to escape. A young man trying to leave the gang still lived in the neighbourhood where officers knew him. He could be questioned whenever violence occurred. Employment applications asked about arrests or convictions. Friends who remained active continued visiting his family. The gang identity followed him from the street into police files and sometimes into court. Residents noticed that ordinary presence could attract suspicion. Standing outside a liquor store, greeting an acquaintance, or driving through a heavily policed area could lead to a search. In 1988, the Los Angeles Times described a former teacher's aide who said officers searched him after he stopped to greet someone outside a South Central store. He supported efforts against drugs but also felt caught by the broad methods being used. His divided reaction was common. Residents wanted action. They did not want indiscriminate action. The distinction became more difficult to preserve as the city moved toward large sweeps. In early 1988, a series of highly publicised gang killings increased public pressure on the LAPD. Chief Darrell Gates responded with operations that placed hundreds, and sometimes approximately 1,000 officers into gang-affected areas. The campaign became known as Operation Hammer. The name reflected the approach. Police intended to overwhelm street activity through numbers, visibility, stops, searches, warrant service, and arrests. In April 1988, an operation involving roughly 1,000 officers resulted in more than 200 arrests by late evening, many in South Central. Contemporary reporting noted that a significant portion of those arrests involved outstanding warrants, traffic matters, and offences other than serious new felonies. From the department's perspective, the sweeps disrupted gang gatherings, removed wanted suspects, recovered weapons, and demonstrated that the streets did not belong to armed groups. Some residents welcomed the show of force. They had complained for years that officers arrived only after shootings. They were tired of dealers operating in public, gang members threatening neighbours, and children being unable to use parks. Seeing large numbers of officers could create temporary relief. People who supported the operations were not necessarily indifferent to police abuse. They were exhausted. A parent who had lost a child might accept tactics she would once have opposed. A shopkeeper whose customers were being frightened away might believe that almost any intervention was preferable to abandonment. Others saw the sweeps as collective punishment. Officers stopped large numbers of people, many of whom were never charged with serious crimes. Young men were ordered to sit or lie on sidewalks, while officers checked names and searched for warrants. Traffic violations and minor offences became grounds for arrest during operations advertised as attacks on violent gangs. Families watched the city use extraordinary resources to arrest people for conduct that would receive less attention elsewhere. One 1988 public criticism of the sweeps pointed out that fewer than 1/5 of arrests made on the street or through warrants involved felonies, and questioned how many uninvolved families were being harmed by broad searches and public humiliation. The raids also entered private homes. Police used armoured battering devices against suspected drug locations, including fortified houses. During one May 1988 raid on South Central Avenue, officers used a battering ram to enter a house, detained 30 people, and searched for cocaine and weapons. A nearby business owner said the impact felt like an earthquake. For officers, fortification created a tactical problem. A reinforced door gave occupants time to destroy evidence, escape, or prepare weapons. Breaking through quickly reduced those risks. For nearby families, the sound and force resembled an attack. Children did not experience a battering ram as a legal strategy. They heard a building being struck. They saw armed officers. They watched adults placed in handcuffs. Even when the target house was involved in drug sales, everyone on the block absorbed the event. The operations often removed dealers for a time. The LAPD's 1989 annual report credited anti-trafficking programs with shutting hundreds of crack houses, arresting thousands of gang members, and reducing the number of identified gang hotspots. The streets did not remain empty. New sellers arrived. People released from jail returned. Drug customers searched for another location. A block could appear quieter for several weeks, and then resume its previous activity under different people. The temporary nature of these gains deepened frustration. Police officers believed courts and overcrowded jails returned suspects to the streets too quickly. Residents saw repeated raids without lasting improvements in schools, employment, housing, or treatment for addiction. Everyone could point to another institution that had failed. The police blamed courts and community silence. Residents blamed police tactics and city neglect. Officials blamed gang culture and drugs. Families continued trying to keep children alive. The relationship became especially difficult after a shooting. Officers arrived looking for information. They separated witnesses, asked who belonged to which set, and searched nearby areas. Family members were grieving, angry, and suspicious. Friends of the victim might know that retaliation was already being discussed. The police wanted names. The family wanted the body covered. Investigators could not wait because evidence disappeared quickly. Relatives could not think clearly because someone they loved had just died. These were not conditions that encouraged trust. A detective who spoke gently could sometimes obtain cooperation. A respected minister or community worker could persuade witnesses to come forward. Specialized prosecutors could spend additional time addressing fears. Operation Hardcore, created to handle violent gang cases, was considered effective partly because its reduced caseload allowed prosecutors to work more carefully with witnesses facing intimidation. Those individual efforts mattered. They were working against years of distrust. Many residents believed the city valued some victims more than others. A shooting in a wealthy neighborhood brought immediate attention, public concern, and pressure for an arrest. A killing in South Central could be described briefly as gang-related, even when the victim's life was more complicated than the label suggested. Once the word gang appeared, the public often assumed the death required no further explanation. Families objected to that reduction. A young man might have associated with a set and still been a student, father, employee, musician, or church member. He could have participated in violence and also been loved. None of that excused his actions. It explained why his death could not be understood only through a police category. The label affected surviving relatives as well. A mother grieving a gang member received less sympathy than other mothers. A child whose father was killed could hear people suggest that the victim had chosen his fate. The family was expected to accept both the death and the judgment attached to it. Police officers also felt judged from a distance. They saw victims whose neighbours refused to speak, arrested suspects who returned quickly, and entered streets where people shouted warnings when patrol cars arrived. Some concluded that the community did not want help. That conclusion ignored the residents who organised marches, called anonymous tip lines, opened youth centres, and confronted dealers. It also ignored the risk involved in visible cooperation. But frustration made broad conclusions attractive. The result was a city in which both police and residents believed the other side had failed to understand the danger they faced. Children grew up watching this relationship. They saw gang members carrying weapons. They saw officers push relatives against patrol cars. They learned not to speak openly around either group. A gang member might ask what they had told the police. An officer might ask what they knew about the gang. The safest answer to both could be nothing. This training in silence began early. It affected how young people understood authority. The gang controlled through reputation and retaliation. The police controlled through law, force, and the power to arrest. The child standing between them learned that both could demand obedience immediately. The difference between lawful authority and neighbourhood power remained important, but it did not always feel important during a frightening encounter. A firearm pointed by a gang member was illegal. A firearm held by an officer was authorised. The body still reacted to both weapons. Families responded by building protection through relationships. Churches organised youth activities. Coaches kept gyms open. Community workers mediated disputes between sets. Mothers formed groups against gang violence and drugs. Neighbours watched children walking home. These efforts rarely had enough funding. A youth program might depend on one exhausted organizer and a temporary grant. A recreation centre could close early because there were not enough staff members. A counsellor might be responsible for more young people than one person could reasonably help. Gang sets offered daily presence. Public programs offered limited hours. That imbalance mattered. A teenager could find the gang outside his home every afternoon. The job program might require 2 bus rides and accept only a small number of applicants. The gang asked for loyalty. The program asked for paperwork, punctuality, and patience. Young people did enter those programs and change their lives. Others never reached them. By the end of the 1980s, families had learned to live with several systems operating at once. The legal city collected rent, provided schools, operated buses, and sent police. The neighbourhood system defined relationships, warnings, and informal safety. The gang system imposed territory and retaliation. The drug market brought customers and money into residential streets. Each system made demands. A parent had to understand all of them. She needed to know the official school boundaries and the unofficial gang boundaries. She needed to know when to call the police and when calling might expose the family. She needed to know which relatives could influence a teenager and which ones would pull him deeper into the street. The knowledge required to keep a household together was extensive. It was rarely recognised as expertise. To outsiders, families who remained in dangerous areas were sometimes accused of failing to leave. Moving required money, available housing, transportation, employment, and the ability to separate from relatives who provided childcare and support. Housing discrimination had not disappeared. Rents in safer neighbourhoods could be beyond reach. A family might also refuse to abandon a home purchased after years of work. The neighbourhood contained grandparents, churches, friends, and memories. Leaving violence meant leaving the people who helped the family survive it. Staying was not always passivity. It could be commitment. Residents cleaned streets after police and cameras departed. They repaired windows damaged by gunfire. They attended funerals, then went to work the next morning. They raised children who did not join gangs despite constant exposure. Those lives were the majority story, though they received the least attention. The streets were described as a war zone. The people living there were not soldiers. They were civilians adapting to danger from several directions. The gangs threatened them through violence, recruitment, and control of public space. The LAPD threatened some of them through aggressive stops, broad classifications, raids, and force. At the same time, police officers remained the only public institution authorized to pursue killers, recover weapons, and intervene when violence began. Residents could distrust the department and still call it for help. They could criticize Operation Hammer while demanding action against the people shooting outside their homes. There was no clean side to choose. There was only the next decision. Allow the child to walk to school or drive him. Speak to the detective or remain silent. Let the older son stay in the house or send him away. Call the police about the drug sales or wait. Open the door when officers knock or demand to see a warrant. Attend the funeral or avoid the gathering. Every decision carried a possible cost. While families made those calculations, the number of armed confrontations continued rising. Each killing produced another investigation, another funeral, and another reason for retaliation. Police answered with larger deployments. Gang members answered by carrying more powerful weapons and becoming more suspicious of anyone who might cooperate. The city was not moving towards stability, it was building pressure. By the beginning of the 1990s, that pressure was visible in homicide totals, overcrowded courts, exhausted hospitals, angry community meetings, and streets where residents no longer trusted that either gangs or police would leave them unharmed. Los Angeles had created an environment in which force was expected to solve nearly every problem. The gangs used force to defend territory and reputation. The police used force to restore control. Ordinary families absorbed the consequences of both approaches, and the deadliest years were still beginning. By the beginning of the 1990s, homicide had become part of the daily structure of Los Angeles. The killings were not distributed evenly across the city. Many neighborhoods remained relatively safe, and millions of residents continued their routines without directly witnessing serious violence. The burden fell most heavily on particular parts of South Los Angeles, East Los Angeles, Compton, and other communities where poverty, gang conflict, drug markets, and firearms were concentrated. For the people living in those areas, the numbers reported at the end of each month were not distant crime statistics. They were empty seats in classrooms. They were photographs placed beside candles. They were names painted on walls. They were young men who had been alive at the beginning of the week and buried before the next one ended. Los Angeles recorded more than 1,000 homicides in 1992, the highest annual total in the city's history. Later accounts generally place the figure at either 1,092 or 1,096, depending on the reporting method and final classification. The Los Angeles Times recorded 1,096 homicides by the end of that year, while later police comparisons commonly used 1,092. The small difference does not change what the year represented. Los Angeles had reached a level of killing that seemed difficult to control and impossible for affected neighborhoods to absorb. The phrase "murder capital" appeared in public discussion because it expressed the fear surrounding the city, not because Los Angeles always had the highest homicide rate in the United States. Other cities sometimes had higher rates when population was taken into account. Los Angeles was enormous, and its total number of killings reflected that size. What made the city appear uniquely frightening was the combination of scale, visibility, and repetition. Helicopters filmed police pursuits from above. Television crews stood behind yellow tape. News reports showed housing projects, graffiti, grieving families, and bodies covered in the street. Gang names that had once been known only within a few neighborhoods became familiar across the country. The violence seemed to confirm the darkest assumptions about South Central, even though those images represented only part of the community's life. The homicide increase had been building for years. California's homicide rate rose by roughly 19% between 1983 and 1992, while the number of gang-related homicides increased by about 400%. Nearly 73% of the state's homicide victims in 1992 were killed with firearms. Black Californians experienced a homicide rate more than 9 times the rate for white residents, and the largest shares of Black and Latino victims were young adults between 20 and 29 years old. Those figures reveal who was dying, but they do not fully explain why. There was no single cause. Crack cocaine contributed to the crisis, but not every killing involved drugs. Gang rivalries contributed, but not every gang-related death involved a fight over territory. Firearms made conflicts more lethal, but guns did not explain why the conflicts began. Poverty increased the number of young people exposed to dangerous environments, but poverty did not automatically produce violence. The homicide peak developed because several pressures were operating at the same time, often in the same neighborhoods, and sometimes within the same household. One of those pressures was the age of the people involved. Violence in Los Angeles increasingly affected teenagers and young adults. Across the United States, firearm mortality rose sharply among younger people during the second half of the 1980s. In 1990, almost 20,000 Americans between the ages of 1 and 34 died from firearm injuries. Among teenagers aged 15 to 19 and young adults aged 20 to 24, firearms accounted for approximately 1 in every 4 deaths. Young men are more likely than older adults to take risks, respond impulsively, and place great importance on peer approval. Those tendencies exist in every community. In neighborhoods where carrying a firearm had become common, and where public disrespect could trigger retaliation, ordinary adolescent behavior acquired deadly consequences. An argument that might once have ended with bruises could end with several gunshot wounds. A teenager did not need to plan a murder for days. He needed access to a gun during a few seconds of anger. The presence of firearms reduced the amount of time available for reconsideration. A fist must be used at close range. A knife usually requires the attacker to approach the victim. A gun allows a frightened or angry person to kill from across a street, from behind a fence, or through the window of a moving car. Immediate access to a weapon also increases the likelihood that a violent confrontation will become fatal. A national study of high school-aged offenders during the 1980s found that firearms were involved in more than 65% of the homicides attributed to offenders in that age range. In Los Angeles, firearms circulated through informal networks. Some were purchased legally and later stolen. Some came from relatives. Some were traded for drugs or money. Some passed between friends, cousins, and members of the same set. The person carrying a weapon on Saturday might not be its owner. He might have borrowed it because a rival had threatened him, or because he expected trouble at a party. That borrowing spread responsibility across a group. A gun used in one killing could later appear in another neighbourhood. The original owner might have no direct involvement in the second shooting. Detectives attempting to trace the weapon encountered a chain of people who feared arrest, retaliation, or both. Firearms also changed the meaning of numerical strength. A small group with several guns could threaten a much larger gathering. One shooter could injure several people in seconds. A rival set no longer had to assemble dozens of members for a confrontation. 2 or 3 people in a car could enter a neighbourhood, fire repeatedly, and leave before police arrived. This encouraged defensive carrying. A young man heard that rivals had semi-automatic pistols, so he obtained one. The rivals heard that his set was armed, so they acquired more weapons. Each side believed it was responding to the other. The amount of firepower increased even when neither group had planned an immediate attack. Crack cocaine intensified the environment by bringing cash into streets where legitimate income was increasingly difficult to obtain. The drug market did not operate as one centrally managed gang enterprise. Individual dealers and small groups often worked independently, even when they belonged to a larger gang set. That fragmentation created competition without stable rules. A seller could be robbed by someone from his own neighbourhood. A supplier could refuse to provide more drugs until an unpaid debt was settled. Customers could bring strangers into residential areas. A dispute over a few $100s could involve several armed people, because none of them could use legal contracts or courts to resolve it. The threat of violence replaced formal enforcement. A dealer who failed to retaliate after a robbery risked being robbed again. A person known to respond violently could protect his business through reputation. The shooting was therefore not only punishment. It was a public message intended for everyone else in the market. That message reached residents who had no connection to the trade. A family living near a sales location heard customers arriving late at night. A shopkeeper faced robbery from people seeking drug money. Children encountered discarded pipes, small bags, and armed sellers. Older residents became afraid to challenge activity outside their own homes. The illegal economy occupied space that the legal economy had abandoned. The decline of industrial employment did not produce an immediate transition from factory work to drug selling. Most unemployed people did not become criminals. Many found lower-paid work, moved elsewhere, relied on relatives, or endured long periods without stable income. The loss of jobs still altered the environment. Earlier generations of black workers had entered manufacturing, aerospace, automotive, tyre, railway, and warehouse employment. Those jobs were often difficult and affected by discrimination, but they offered wages to people without university degrees. By the 1980s, many of those positions had disappeared or become harder to obtain. A young person could no longer assume that adulthood would bring a stable industrial job. The legal labour market demanded education, transportation, experience and patience. The street market demanded availability, nerve, and local connections. That difference was especially important for teenagers who believed they had little time to prove themselves. Drug income was immediate and visible. Legitimate advancement was slow and uncertain. The young dealer drove through the neighbourhood. The successful worker might leave before dawn and return after dark. his achievement less visible to the people outside. The street therefore gave the appearance that illegal work produced greater rewards. It concealed the arrests, addiction, robbery, injury and early death that often followed. The homicide rate also climbed because retaliation had become self-sustaining. A gang killing did not end when the victim died. It created new obligations among friends and relatives. Someone was expected to answer. The response might come immediately or months later. The intended target might not be found. Another member of the rival set might be attacked instead. His friends then considered themselves victims of an unprovoked shooting because they understood only the most recent event. The sequence continued. By the early 1990s, some rivalries were so old that younger members had no clear knowledge of how they began. They knew the names of people recently killed. They knew which neighbourhoods were considered enemies. That was enough. The original disagreement no longer mattered. The accumulated deaths justified the conflict. Funerals became dangerous moments because they gathered grieving members in one place. Police sometimes attended or monitored services in anticipation of retaliation. Families had to consider whether displaying gang colours, photographs or street names would invite another attack. Memorials could preserve affection and deepen division at the same time. A photograph on a shirt reminded friends that the victim had been loved. The slogan beneath the photograph could promise revenge. Children saw both messages. The high number of shootings placed hospitals under constant pressure. Emergency physicians and nurses became experienced in treating gunshot wounds, but experience did not make the injuries routine. A victim could arrive without identification. Staff members attempted to save him while police secured clothing, bullets, and other evidence. Relatives gathered in waiting rooms. Friends sometimes arrived before officers understood the connections between the people present. Hospital security had to consider whether a rival might enter to complete an attack or whether an argument among mourners could become violent. The emergency room became another point where the neighbourhood conflict met a public institution. A doctor saw tissue damage. A detective saw evidence. A mother saw her child. Each person experienced the same body differently. Some victims survived injuries that would have been fatal in earlier decades because emergency medicine had improved. Faster transport, trauma centres, surgical techniques, and better medical organisation saved lives. That success may also have affected how homicide trends should be understood. The number of murders counted only those who died. It did not include every person shot, permanently disabled, or saved after extensive treatment. A decline in death did not necessarily mean the same decline in violent intent. Likewise, a rising homicide total reflected both the frequency of attacks and the lethality of weapons, location of wounds, response time, and available medical care. Police officers faced a growing number of cases with limited cooperation. Many gang shootings involved strangers or loosely connected acquaintances. Witnesses feared being identified. Cars allowed suspects to disappear quickly. Darkness, distance, and confusion reduced the accuracy of descriptions. A homicide detective could believe he knew which set was responsible and still lack evidence sufficient for an arrest. The suspected shooter continued living in the neighbourhood. The victim's friends concluded that police would not provide justice. Retaliation appeared to offer a faster answer. This did not mean residents rejected the legal system entirely. Families repeatedly asked detectives for progress. Mothers attended hearings. Community leaders encouraged witnesses to speak. Specialised prosecutors devoted additional resources to violent gang cases. The system moved slowly. The street response could occur within hours. That difference in speed strengthened informal justice. Police tactics created another obstacle. Broad sweeps, repeated stops, and aggressive raids had convinced many young residents that officers saw them all as possible gang members. Even people who wanted a murder solved hesitated to cooperate with a department they did not trust. An officer investigating a killing might not be the same officer who had pushed the witness against a wall the previous week. To the witness, both officers represented the LAPD. Institutional trust did not separate itself by assignment. The department was under pressure as well. Officers saw young victims, armed suspects, frightened witnesses, and neighbourhoods where shootings continued despite repeated arrests. They believed stronger enforcement was necessary because earlier methods had failed. That belief encouraged more stops and searches. The additional pressure produced more resentment. The resentment reduced cooperation. Reduced cooperation made cases harder to solve. Unsolved killings encouraged retaliation. The cycle linked police practice to gang violence without making police responsible for the original crime. Media coverage added another force. The phrase gang-related became a quick explanation for a homicide. It informed viewers that the death belonged to a recognisable category, but it could also close public curiosity. A gang-related victim was easily treated as someone who had accepted the risk. The public did not ask whether he had joined at 12, attempted to leave at 18, worked during the week, supported a child, or happened to be standing beside the intended target. The label could be accurate and incomplete. Families understood this immediately. They saw a person reduced to one association. A mother might admit that her son had belonged to a set while insisting that membership did not explain everything he had been. The news report moved to the next killing before she could make that distinction. The repeated coverage also shaped how outsiders viewed entire neighbourhoods. People who had never visited South Central imagined uninterrupted gunfire and universal gang membership. Employers distrusted applicants with local addresses. Businesses avoided investment. Families with enough money moved away. Each departure removed customers, workers, homeowners, and political influence. The neighbourhood became more isolated. Isolation made the most violent people more visible. The cycle operated socially as well as economically. The number of gang territories continued growing through fragmentation. A large set could divide after internal disputes. Younger members formed a new group around several blocks. Former allies became rivals. The new conflict added another boundary, another list of targets, and another reason to carry weapons. Police and researchers counted hundreds of separate groups across the county. The exact number changed depending on definitions and the activity of individual sets. What mattered was that no single truce could end the wider conflict. Even respected gang figures controlled only limited areas and limited numbers of people. A peace agreement between two sets could save lives locally. It could not bind hundreds of other groups. The absence of central authority made the violence flexible and persistent. Arresting a leader did not cause the set to disappear. It might create a struggle among younger members competing for influence. A person capable of restraining impulsive members could be replaced by someone eager to prove himself. Law enforcement therefore faced a structure that could survive repeated arrests. The community faced the same problem. Parents and intervention workers could calm one group of teenagers, while another group prepared retaliation several streets away. Rumours moved faster than mediators. A false report that someone had been attacked could produce a real shooting before anyone confirmed what happened. The violence was not only planned, it was reactive. It depended on pride, fear, grief, and uncertainty. Those emotions were strongest among people who had already lost friends and relatives. Trauma accumulated without being named. A teenager who had seen several people killed might become emotionally detached, quick to anger, or constantly alert. Adults could interpret those reactions as proof that he lacked feeling. In reality, detachment could be a way of functioning in an environment where grief never had time to end. One funeral followed another. There was little access to counselling. Friends used alcohol or drugs. Families told children to remain strong. Strength often meant silence. A young man could carry the memory of a shooting while also being expected to retaliate for it. Fear and grief were redirected into aggression because aggression was socially acceptable in a way vulnerability was not. The homicide crisis was therefore not only a problem of armed offenders, It was a problem of repeated exposure producing more people prepared for violence. California's 1992 homicide figures showed how heavily the burden fell on young Black and Latino men. Of the state's 4,092 homicide deaths that year, nearly 84% were male, and the largest groups of victims were between 15 and 34 years old. The statistics described a public health emergency as well as a criminal justice emergency. The criminal justice response focused on identifying offenders, making arrests, and securing convictions. The public health view asked how guns, trauma, poverty, family instability, schools, addiction, and neighborhood conditions increased the likelihood of death. Los Angeles relied more heavily on the first response. Police deployments expanded, prosecutors developed specialized gang units, sentences grew longer, prisons received more young men from the same neighborhoods. These measures removed dangerous individuals and prevented some immediate attacks. They also left the underlying recruitment environment intact. A teenager arrested for carrying a gun disappeared from the corner. Another teenager took his place. The weapon remained available. The rivalry continued. The job market did not improve. The school still released students into the same neighborhood. Long-term prevention required coordination between schools, courts, police, community groups, treatment programs, employers, and residents. A Los Angeles County Task Force report issued in 1992 concluded that gang violence was too complex for a single solution and required prevention, early intervention, education, treatment, community mobilization, and cooperation among public and private institutions. That conclusion was reasonable. It was also difficult to implement quickly. Police could conduct a sweep in one evening. A school improvement plan took years. A factory could close in months. Replacing thousands of stable jobs could take decades. A gun could be purchased in a day. Building trust between residents and police required repeated contact over generations. The city continued choosing the actions that produced immediate, visible results. Arrest totals could be announced. Weapons could be displayed at press conferences. Officers could occupy an intersection for a weekend. The effects of prevention were quieter. A teenager who did not join a gang did not become a statistic. A conflict resolved by an intervention worker did not appear on the evening news. A child kept in school by a coach was difficult to measure. Violence was counted more easily than its absence. By 1991 and 1992, Los Angeles had reached the point where high homicide totals seemed normal enough to be expected and shocking enough to dominate public life. The city entered each year wondering whether the number would exceed the previous one. Residents listened for sirens. Detectives began new files before old cases were closed. Hospitals prepared for weekend shootings. Funeral directors recognized families returning with another young relative. Children learned street boundaries before they understood city government. The killing did not stop ordinary life. It existed inside ordinary life. People still went to work, attended school, cooked dinner, celebrated birthdays, and waited for buses. A neighborhood could be quiet for hours before several shots changed the direction of multiple families. That suddenness made the crisis difficult to describe. The city was not continuously at war. It was repeatedly interrupted by acts that resembled war. The highest annual count arrived in 1992, the same year Los Angeles experienced one of the largest episodes of civil unrest in modern American history. The killings connected to the unrest contributed to the total, but they did not create the record by themselves. By April, the city was already recording hundreds of homicides, with especially high counts in police divisions covering parts of South and Central Los Angeles. The conditions producing those deaths had been building for decades. Segregation had concentrated disadvantage. Industrial decline had reduced stable employment. Gang fragmentation had multiplied territorial disputes. Crack had financed an illegal market. Firearms had made confrontation more lethal. Police tactics had weakened trust. Unsolved killings had encouraged retaliation. Trauma had shaped a new generation. Los Angeles had not become violent because one institution failed or one drug appeared. It had become violent because each part of the crisis strengthened the others. The record number in 1992 was not the beginning of the story. It was the point at which years of pressure became impossible for the rest of the city to ignore. By then, another crisis had already destroyed much of the remaining confidence between South Los Angeles and the LAPD. A home video recorded several officers beating a black motorist after a police pursuit. The footage travelled around the world. A year later, the officers were acquitted in a suburban courtroom. For residents who had complained about police violence for years, the recording appeared to provide undeniable evidence. The verdict appeared to show that even visible evidence was not enough. The homicide crisis had filled the streets with grief and fear. The Rodney King case would add rage. Los Angeles was approaching the moment when those forces would meet. Los Angeles did not suddenly become unstable on April 29, 1992. The city had been moving toward that date for years. The immediate cause of the unrest would be a jury's decision in the trial of 4 police officers. The deeper causes were already present in the homes, streets, courtrooms, police stations, schools and businesses of Los Angeles. Residents had watched homicide increase while stable jobs disappeared. They had watched gang boundaries divide neighbourhoods, while police operations treated large numbers of young men as suspects. They had heard repeated promises that conditions would improve after the next commission, the next programme, or the next election. Many had stopped believing those promises. The relationship between black residents and the Los Angeles Police Department carried decades of conflict. The 1965 Watts uprising had followed an arrest that became a confrontation between officers and residents. The commission appointed after that violence identified poor police-community relations as one of several major problems. In the years that followed, complaints of unnecessary force, racist language, humiliating stops and aggressive searches continued. The department responded that its officers worked in dangerous neighbourhoods under difficult conditions. Both statements could be true. Officers were being sent into areas where armed gang members operated, witnesses feared cooperation, and routine encounters could become violent. Residents were being policed by an institution whose aggressive culture often treated suspicion as justification for immediate control. Each side believed the other failed to understand the risks it faced. For many residents, police misconduct was not an unusual event seen only in major news stories. It appeared in ordinary encounters. A young man could be stopped while walking home. A driver could be pulled from a car. A group standing outside could be ordered against a wall and searched. Most of those incidents were not recorded. The officer wrote the report. The person stopped returned home with his own account. Families and neighbours decided which version they believed. That system depended heavily on police credibility. When an officer and a resident described the same event differently, courts, supervisors, and the wider public usually gave greater weight to the officer's statement. Residents might file a complaint, but many expected little result. Others avoided the complaint process because they feared additional attention from police. The lack of visible evidence made every accusation easier to dismiss. Then, on the night of March 3rd, 1991, someone turned on a video camera. Rodney Glenn King was 25 years old. He had been driving with 2 passengers when California Highway Patrol officers attempted to stop him for speeding. King did not stop immediately. A pursuit followed through the San Fernando Valley. King later acknowledged that he had been drinking and feared that a new arrest would violate the terms of his parole. Whatever his reason for fleeing, the chase created a dangerous situation. Officers did not know whether he was armed or why he had refused to stop. By the time King finally pulled over near the intersection of Foothill Boulevard and Osborne Street, several police units and a helicopter had gathered. The passengers obeyed police instructions and were taken into custody. King exited the car. The encounter that followed lasted only a few minutes. From a nearby apartment, George Holliday heard the police activity and used a home video camera to record what he could see. His footage showed Los Angeles police officers surrounding King, striking him repeatedly with metal batons, kicking him, and using an electric stun device as he fell, attempted to rise, and moved on the ground. The recording did not capture every moment before the beating. It did not explain what officers had been told during the pursuit, or what they believed King might do. It captured enough. The Department of Justice later described the videotaped beating on March 3, 1991, as one of the most significant police misconduct cases handled by its criminal section. The video was given to a local television station and then broadcast across the country. Viewers watched the blows repeatedly. The footage appeared to provide something residents had rarely possessed during earlier disputes with the police, an independent visual record. For many black Angelenos, the recording was not shocking because the conduct seemed impossible. It was shocking because conduct they had described for years was finally visible to everyone else. People who had been stopped or beaten by officers saw confirmation. Parents who had warned their sons about the police saw confirmation. Community activists who had been accused of exaggerating saw confirmation. The question was no longer whether the public would believe a resident's account over an officer's report. The public could watch the event directly. That expectation gave the case enormous importance. Rodney King became more than an individual who had fled from police and been beaten after a pursuit. His case became a test of whether the legal system could hold officers accountable when their actions had been recorded. The 4 officers prosecuted in state court were Stacey Kuhn, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wind, and Theodore Brasino. They faced charges including assault and excessive use of force. Their defense argued that the video had to be understood within police training and that King's movements made officers believe he continued to present a threat. Prosecutors argued that the amount of force was unnecessary and criminal. The case placed police procedure before a jury, but it also placed the entire history of police-community relations in Los Angeles behind the evidence. Residents were not judging the case only from the legal instructions that would be given at trial. They were judging it through years of personal and collective experience. Before the trial began, another killing deepened tension in South Central. On March 16th, 1991, 13 days after the King beating, 15-year-old Latasha Harlins entered the Empire Liquor Market in South Los Angeles. The store was owned by a Korean-American family and operated that morning by Soon Ja-do. Do believed Harlins was attempting to steal a bottle of orange juice. A confrontation followed. Security video showed Harlins placing the bottle in her backpack while holding money in her hand. Do grabbed at the girl. Harlins struck Do during the struggle. Harlins then placed the bottle on the counter and turned toward the door. Do fired a handgun. The bullet struck Harlins in the back of the head. She died inside the store. The shooting became another widely discussed case because it combined several tensions already present in Los Angeles. Fear of theft, the treatment of black customers in neighborhood stores, the isolation of Korean immigrant merchants, economic competition, and the value the justice system appeared to place on a young black life. Relations between some black residents and Korean-American shopkeepers had become strained during the 1980s. Korean immigrants had purchased liquor stores, grocery markets, and small businesses in neighborhoods where larger companies were reluctant to invest. Many worked long hours, lived with the possibility of robbery, and had limited English. Black customers sometimes believed they were watched, followed, or treated automatically as thieves. Store owners sometimes believed customers did not understand the threats they faced. Language differences made ordinary disagreements harder to resolve. Neither community had created the economic abandonment surrounding those stores, but they encountered one another inside it every day. The killing of Latasha Harlins turned those tensions into open anger. Soon, Ja-do was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Judge Joyce Carlin sentenced her to probation, community service, a fine, and no prison time. To many residents, the sentence demonstrated that the legal system did not consider Harlins' death serious enough to require imprisonment. Do had fired a teenager who was moving away from her, yet she returned home rather than entering prison. The law had produced a conviction. the sentence still felt like an acquittal. The King and Harlin's cases were different. One involved police officers after a pursuit. The other involved a merchant and a customer during a dispute. They became connected in public memory because both involved recorded violence against black victims, and both raised the question of what punishment, if any, would follow. The video camera had shown what happened. That no longer seemed to guarantee accountability. While these cases moved through court, the LAPD itself came under formal examination. Mayor Tom Bradley appointed the Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department, chaired by attorney Warren Christopher. The commission investigated the department's use of force, discipline, recruitment, training, complaint procedures, and leadership. Its work confirmed that concerns about the LAPD could not be reduced to a few hostile activists or isolated personal disputes. The Commission found serious weaknesses in the department's handling of excessive force complaints. It identified officers who repeatedly received allegations of improper force and concluded that the department's disciplinary system often failed to respond effectively. The report also criticised an internal culture that emphasised aggressive crime control while tolerating conduct that damaged public trust. The findings did not claim that every LAPD officer was abusive. Most officers did not accumulate repeated force complaints. Many performed difficult work professionally. The significance of the report was that the department had failed to identify and control the smaller number of officers whose conduct created repeated problems. This distinction mattered little to a resident being struck or humiliated. Institutional failure could be produced by a minority of officers if supervisors, complaint systems, and department leaders protected or ignored them. Chief Darrell Gates became the central figure in the debate. Gates had led the LAPD since 1978. He was respected by supporters who viewed him as a strong defender of officers and an innovative police administrator. Under his leadership, the department expanded specialised units, tactical operations, drug enforcement, and gang suppression. Critics believed he represented a department unwilling to admit wrongdoing. Gates often responded defensively to accusations against the LAPD. His public statements could appear dismissive to communities already convinced that the department did not take their complaints seriously. The demand for his resignation grew after the King beating. Gates refused to leave immediately. The resulting struggle between the chief, the mayor, the police commission, community leaders, and political officials showed that even after the video, institutional change would be slow. Residents heard another set of promises. Recommendations would be studied. Policies would be revised. Training would improve. The officer's trial still appeared to be the most direct test. The location of that trial became another source of distrust. A state appeals court moved the proceedings out of Los Angeles County's central urban area to Simi Valley and Ventura County. The decision followed concern that intense publicity would make it difficult to find an impartial jury in Los Angeles. Simi Valley had a smaller black population than Los Angeles and was home to many law enforcement officers and their families. The jury did not include black jurors. The legal purpose of moving a trial is to reduce prejudice and obtain fairness. Many Los Angeles residents believed the move produced the opposite result. They saw officers accused of beating a black man being judged outside the city, before a jury drawn from a community perceived as friendly to law enforcement. The trial began in March 1992. Jurors watched the holiday video repeatedly, sometimes frame by frame. The defense slowed the footage, divided it into sections, and explained particular movements as moments when officers believed force was justified. What had appeared to the public as one continuous beating was broken into individual decisions. This was a legitimate defense strategy. It also changed the way the recording was understood. At normal speed, the video showed a man surrounded and struck again and again. At reduced speed, each movement could be examined as a separate possible threat. The defense asked jurors to see the event through the officer's training and perception. The prosecution asked them to consider the full amount of force and the condition of the man receiving it. Los Angeles waited. The city was already tense for reasons beyond the trial. Homicides remained extremely high. Gang shootings had exhausted residents and police. The crack market continued damaging families. The national economy had entered a recession. Unemployment affected communities that had never fully recovered from earlier industrial decline. Many small businesses operated with little protection or financial reserve. Black residents felt abandoned by city institutions. Korean American merchants felt vulnerable to robbery and unsupported by police. Latino immigrants and workers lived throughout the affected neighborhoods, often with little political influence and limited access to services. The population of South Central was changing. The area was no longer only a black community. Increasing numbers of Latino families lived beside black families, attended the same schools, worked in the same low-wage economy, and faced many of the same housing and employment problems. Television coverage still presented the coming crisis mainly as a confrontation between black residents and a largely white police department. That was one important part of the story. It was not the entire city. Los Angeles in 1992 contained overlapping tensions involving race, class, immigration, policing, business ownership, political representation, gang violence, and economic insecurity. A single verdict could not create those tensions. It could provide the event around which they gathered. City officials understood that an acquittal might produce protests. Police prepared for demonstrations, but the preparations were incomplete and poorly coordinated. The LAPD had faced civil disturbances before, yet commanders did not appear ready for unrest, spreading rapidly across several parts of the city. Part of the problem was uncertainty. A police department cannot occupy every intersection in advance of a verdict. A heavy deployment before any violence begins can itself increase tension. Officers must be positioned close enough to respond while avoiding the appearance that the city expects residents to riot. These decisions require communication and trust. Los Angeles had little of either. Community leaders asked residents to remain peaceful. Ministers planned gatherings. Activists prepared demonstrations. Most people intended to watch the verdict, express anger if necessary, and return home. The city was not filled with people waiting for permission to destroy it. Many residents feared what could happen. They remembered Watts. They also knew 1992 was not 1965. The city was larger. Gang conflicts were more heavily armed. The population was more diverse. Television could spread images immediately. Police helicopters could show events across the region while they were still happening. The social environment had also changed. In 1965, many industrial jobs remained in Los Angeles, and federal anti-poverty programs were expanding. By 1992, stable working-class employment had declined, public institutions were strained, and years of punitive drug policy had filled prisons without restoring confidence in neighborhood safety. The promise that economic growth would eventually solve inequality had become harder to believe. On Wednesday, April 29th, the jury announced that it had reached verdicts. People gathered around televisions in homes, offices, schools, bars, stores, and public buildings. The jurors acquitted the officers on most charges. They failed to reach a verdict on one charge against Lawrence Powell. The legal process had produced its answer. For residents who believed the video had made acquittal impossible, the answer was difficult to understand. They had watched the batons. They had watched King fall. They had heard that visual proof would make this case different from every earlier complaint. Now the officers were leaving court without convictions. The verdict did not tell angry residents that no beating had occurred. It told them that the state had failed to prove criminal guilt under the charges and instructions presented to that jury. That legal distinction had almost no emotional force outside the courtroom. People saw officers beat a man on video. A jury saw no proven crime. Everything the city had asked residents to trust appeared to have failed at once. The police had failed to control their officers. Department discipline had failed. The courts had failed. The video had failed. even evidence people could see with their own eyes had failed. Crowds began gathering near the intersection of Florence and Normandy in south-central Los Angeles. People discussed the verdict, shouted at passing cars, and expressed anger. The gathering was not yet the large-scale unrest that would follow. The police response was uncertain. Officers entered and withdrew. Commanders struggled to understand what was happening and how many resources were available. At Parker Center, LAPD leadership did not immediately organize a response equal to the speed at which events were developing. The first acts of violence created an opportunity for more. Objects were thrown at vehicles, drivers were pulled from cars, stores were entered, small groups discovered that police were not controlling the intersections. Television helicopters showed the violence live, allowing viewers throughout the city to see both the attacks and the absence of an effective police response. One of the most widely remembered victims was truck driver Reginald Denny, who was pulled from his vehicle and beaten at Florence and Normandy. Other motorists were attacked as well, including Fidel Lopez, who was dragged from his truck and severely assaulted. These attacks were not acts of justice for Rodney King. The victims had not participated in the beating or the trial. They were people who happened to drive into an intersection where a crowd had taken control. Several residents intervened to help the injured. The people who rescued Denny had watched the attack on television and went to the intersection. Their actions rarely received the same repeated attention as the beating itself, but they showed that even as violence spread, residents were attempting to protect strangers. The situation moved beyond protest. Looting began in commercial areas. Fires were set. Police officers withdrew from some locations because commanders believed the available personnel could not safely control the crowds. That withdrawal had consequences across the city. Residents called for help and received no immediate response. Business owners waited for officers who did not arrive. Firefighters attempting to reach burning buildings faced gunfire and attacks. The absence of police protection was especially damaging in and around Koreatown. Many Korean-American merchants believed the LAPD had abandoned their businesses while concentrating resources elsewhere. Some armed themselves and stood on rooftops or outside stores. These images later became symbols, but the people involved were not participating in a performance. They were frightened shopkeepers who believed their livelihoods could be destroyed in a single night. Black anger over the Harlins case and years of tense customer-merchant relations contributed to attacks on Korean-owned businesses. Yet the unrest cannot be understood as a simple conflict between black residents and Korean merchants. Latino-owned, black-owned, white-owned, and other businesses were also damaged. Participants came from several racial and ethnic groups. Many victims of the violence were themselves black or Latino residents of the affected communities. The destruction followed opportunity, resentment, location, and confusion, rather than one consistent political purpose. Some people attacked symbols of authority. Some stole food, clothing, electronics, or alcohol. Some settled personal disputes. Some set fires to conceal theft. Some watched. Some tried to stop the destruction. Some protected neighbours. Large public disturbances contain people acting for different reasons at the same time. Calling every participant a protester ignores the criminal violence. Calling every participant a criminal ignores the political anger and the people who gathered without looting or attacking anyone. The term riot describes the disorder. The term uprising describes the conditions and anger behind it. Neither word explains every person involved. During the first hours, city officials appeared unable to establish control. Mayor Tom Bradley condemned the verdict and appealed for calm. Chief Gates faced criticism for the department's preparation and response. California Governor Pete Wilson activated the National Guard. The deployment did not become effective immediately. Troops required equipment, transportation, orders, and coordination with local agencies. Political leaders announced that help was coming while residents continued watching buildings burn. The gap between announcement and arrival increased the sense that no institution was in charge. The unrest spread beyond the original intersection. Fires and looting appeared across South Central, Koreatown, parts of downtown, and other areas of Los Angeles County. Smoke covered sections of the city. Television broadcasts showed columns of fire rising from commercial streets. Those buildings were not empty symbols. They contained jobs, pharmacies, grocery stores, medical offices, restaurants, and small businesses. Many served neighborhoods already lacking investment. Destroying them harmed the same residents whose anger helped produce the unrest. That fact did not make the anger unreal. It showed how public disorder can direct justified grievance toward destructive outcomes. President George H.W. Bush eventually federalized National Guard units and sent federal troops and law enforcement officers. The combined deployment helped restore control. By the time the unrest ended, the official toll remained difficult to calculate precisely. Contemporary Los Angeles reporting 6 months later listed 53 deaths, 2,383 injuries, approximately 17,000 arrests, and more than 1,000 damaged structures, with losses measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. Later sources have used different death and damage totals because officials revised classifications and applied different definitions. A public health assessment reported 53 deaths, 2,325 injuries, more than 600 buildings destroyed by fire, and about $735 million in damage. The disagreement between totals reflects the difficulty of separating deaths and losses directly caused by the unrest from events occurring during the same period. The scale is clear even when the final number varies. Thousands were injured or arrested, businesses were destroyed, residents lost work, families lost access to local services. People who had survived gang violence and aggressive policing now faced burned neighborhoods, military patrols, and another national image of South Central as a place defined by danger. The verdict had been the trigger. It was not a complete explanation. The city had reached April 1992 through years of unresolved conflict. Police misconduct had weakened faith in lawful authority. Gang violence had made daily life insecure. Economic decline had reduced legitimate opportunity. Drug markets had damaged families and public space. The killing of Latasha Harlins had deepened the belief that black victims did not receive equal justice. The trial's location and jury composition had increased suspicion before the verdict was announced. Then the verdict confirmed what many residents already believed. The system could see the same evidence they saw and reach an entirely different conclusion. That belief made restraint harder to defend. Community leaders could ask people to trust the courts. The courts had just delivered the result. Officials could ask people to trust the police. The video showed the police beating Rodney King. The mayor could promise reform. Residents had heard reform promised before. None of this justified attacking motorists, burning homes, or destroying businesses. Historical explanation is not moral approval. The people harmed during the unrest were not responsible for the King verdict, and many were residents of the same communities that had suffered from police abuse and economic neglect. Understanding the destruction requires holding both realities together. The violence was wrong. The conditions behind the explosion were real. The city had treated those conditions as separate problems. Gang violence belonged to police units. Poverty belonged to social agencies. Unemployment belonged to economic policy. Police abuse belonged to complaint boards and courts. Racial tension belonged to community meetings. In daily life, they were connected. The same young man could be unemployed, stopped repeatedly by police, exposed to gang violence, and living beside a drug market. The same business owner could fear robbery, distrust local customers, receive little police protection, and lose everything during the unrest. The same mother could demand an end to police brutality and beg officers to arrest the person who shot her son. Los Angeles had attempted to address each crisis without confronting the system that allowed them to reinforce one another. After the fires, the city would again create reports, investigations, rebuilding programs, and promises of reform. Chief Gates would leave the LAPD. federal prosecutors would bring civil rights charges against the officers involved in the King beating. Political leaders would speak about investment and reconciliation. Gang violence would not disappear when the smoke cleared. Poverty would not end. Distrust of police would not be repaired by one prosecution. The streets damaged during the unrest still contained the borders, losses and rivalries that had shaped them before April 29th. The city had survived the explosion. It now had to decide whether rebuilding meant replacing burned structures or changing the conditions that had made the explosion possible. When the fires were extinguished in May 1992, South Los Angeles did not return to the condition it had been in before the unrest. The buildings could be counted, the arrests could be recorded, insurance companies could estimate the financial damage. None of those measurements captured the full effect on the people who remained. Residents had lived through several days in which ordinary city authority had broken down. Police officers had withdrawn from some streets. Firefighters had struggled to reach burning buildings. Store owners had watched years of work disappear. Families had remained indoors while smoke entered their homes, and gunfire continued outside. When the National Guard and federal forces restored order, the emergency ended before the underlying problems did. The same gang rivalries remained. The same drug markets remained. The same schools, housing projects, and struggling commercial streets remained. The police department that had lost the trust of many residents was still responsible for protecting them. Political leaders again promised that Los Angeles would rebuild. The word rebuild suggested that the city needed to replace damaged stores and repair burned structures. South Los Angeles needed more than construction. It needed jobs, reliable services, safe schools, fair policing, affordable housing, and long-term investment. Those needs had already been identified after the Watts Uprising in 1965. They had not been met by 1992. Several rebuilding organisations and programmes appeared after the unrest. The largest and best known was Rebuild LA, led initially by businessman Peter Ueberroth. Its supporters hoped private companies would bring supermarkets, factories, retail stores and employment into neighbourhoods that had experienced years of disinvestment. The effort produced some investment, but it did not transform South Los Angeles on the scale residents had been promised. Businesses made decisions according to expected profit, insurance costs, land prices, and consumer demand. A corporation might announce plans for a store and later decide the project was too expensive. A new retail location could create jobs, but many positions paid low wages and did not replace the industrial employment that had supported earlier generations. The difference between a factory job and a retail job mattered. A factory could offer full-time hours, union representation, and wages capable of supporting a family. A new shop might offer part-time shifts, limited benefits, and little opportunity for advancement. Officials could count both as employment. The family, depending on the paycheck, understood the difference. Rebuilding also became complicated because some owners chose not to reopen. They had lost inventory, equipment, or buildings. Insurance payments did not always cover the cost of returning. Some were afraid that another period of unrest or continued gang violence would destroy the business again. Residents then faced a second loss. First the store burned, then the vacant property remained. An empty commercial building attracted dumping, vandalism, and illegal activity. A shopping street that had once provided groceries, medicine, or work could remain damaged long after television crews stopped filming it. The physical recovery moved unevenly from one block to another. The violence also continued. Los Angeles reached its record homicide total in 1992, but the number began falling during the years that followed. This decline became one of the largest and most important changes in the city's recent history. By the end of the 1990s and into the following decade, Los Angeles was recording far fewer killings than it had at the early 1990s peak. No single policy caused that reduction. The decline occurred across many American cities, including places that used different policing strategies and different social programs. The crack market changed. The The population aged, emergency medicine improved, employment conditions shifted, gun violence prevention efforts expanded. Some of the most active offenders were imprisoned or grew older. Residents changed their behaviour. Gang intervention workers prevented retaliations that never appeared in official records. Police practices also changed, though not always in ways residents welcomed. Because these forces operated together, claims that one mayor, police chief, law or programme solved the crisis should be treated carefully. One important development began before the uprising itself. On April 26, 1992, only 3 days before the Rodney King verdict, representatives of several rival gangs in Watts agreed to a truce. Members associated with the Grape Street Crips, P.J. Watts Crips, Bounty Hunter Bloods, and Hacienda Village Bloods participated in the agreement. The truce had grown from earlier peace efforts led by gang members, former members, ministers, activists, and community organisers. They argued that young black men were killing one another, while the wider political and economic problems facing their neighbourhoods remained unchanged. This message was not new. The difficulty was persuading people to stop retaliating when each side could name recent victims. A truce required participants to accept that another killing would not repair the last one. It also required enough communication to prevent rumours, insults, and individual acts from restarting the wider conflict. The agreement did not unite every Crip and Blood set in Los Angeles. It did not end drug dealing, robbery, or personal violence. Some rivalries continued, and not every member accepted the decisions of older or respected figures. Its importance came from the fact that people directly involved in long-running conflicts had attempted to stop them without waiting for police or government officials. During the unrest that followed the King verdict, participants in the Watts Truce largely maintained their agreement. The affected neighbourhood still experienced disorder, but the peace effort showed that gang identity did not make continued warfare inevitable. Truce organisers also demanded economic investment. They understood that peace could not depend only on asking young men to behave differently while leaving the neighbourhood unchanged. A teenager needed a reason to believe that refusing gang life would lead somewhere. That required jobs, training, recreation, education and safety. The city was better at responding to violence than supporting peace. Police operations could receive money quickly because their results were visible. Officers could make arrests and display seized weapons. Community organisers needed years of reliable funding, trusted relationships and staff members willing to enter conflicts before shootings occurred. Their successes were harder to demonstrate. When an intervention worker persuaded two groups not to retaliate, there was no body, crime scene or arrest to count. Nothing happened. That was the achievement. The reduction in violence during the 1990s changed daily life gradually. Parents did not wake one morning and decide the crisis had ended. They continued using the rules developed during the deadliest years. Children were called indoors before dark. Teenagers avoided particular streets. Families listened for cars slowing outside. Fear remained after the statistical danger declined. A neighbourhood can become safer faster than its residents feel safe. People remembered who had been killed. They remembered bullets entering houses and police raids entering bedrooms. A parent who had buried one child did not relax because a citywide chart showed fewer homicides. The younger generation inherited these memories. Children who had watched the unrest on television became adults in neighbourhoods where burned properties and damaged institutions remained visible. Some entered gangs. Others became teachers, police officers, business owners, ministers, artists, and community organisers. Many refused the idea that their neighbourhoods should be understood only through crime. South Central was officially renamed South Los Angeles by the City Council in 2003. Supporters believed the old name had become too closely connected to violence, gangs, poverty, and the 1992 unrest. Changing the name could not erase those associations. People continued using South Central. sometimes because it described a specific geographic and cultural identity that South Los Angeles did not fully replace. For residents, the older name could carry pride as well as stigma. An address described more than danger. It described music, family, churches, food, schools, political movements, and local history. The population of the area was also changing significantly. During the later 20th century, Latino families increasingly moved into neighborhoods that had once been predominantly black. Immigration from Mexico and Central America, combined with the movement of some black families to other parts of Los Angeles County and the Inland Empire, changed schools, businesses, churches, and residential streets. Some neighborhoods became largely Latino. Others remained mixed. The change did not remove poverty or gang conflict. It altered how those conditions were experienced. Black and Latino gangs sometimes fought over territory. Racial hostility became part of some conflicts, particularly inside prisons and in neighborhoods where demographic change was rapid. In other places, black and Latino residents lived beside one another without organized conflict. Their children attended the same schools. Adults worked together, married into one another's families, shared businesses, and faced the same lack of affordable housing and stable employment. Public discussion often looked for a simple racial story. Daily life remained more complicated, and gang identities adapted to those changes. The Crips and Bloods did not disappear when homicide declined. Sets continued operating, and long-standing rivalries survived. Some members participated in drug sales, robbery, or violence. Others aged out, moved away, went to prison, or maintained social ties without continuing active criminal involvement. The meaning of gang membership also varied. For one person, it remained a serious commitment involving violence and criminal activity. For another, it was an identity formed during adolescence that followed him long after he stopped participating. Police records did not always reflect that difference. A man in his 30s could still be treated according to associations documented when he was 16. He might have children, employment, and no recent violent activity while continuing to live near relatives from the same set. Leaving a gang was not always an official event. There was no resignation letter. A person could simply stop spending time on the street, avoid conflicts, work, raise a family, and hope old enemies did not continue to view him as a target. Many former members became intervention workers. Their histories gave them access that police officers and outside social workers did not have. They knew the families, language, rivalries, and older events behind current disputes. They could enter a hospital after a shooting and speak to angry friends before retaliation was organised. They could identify whether a rumour was accurate or whether someone had blamed the wrong set. This work required credibility. An intervention worker had to be respected enough that armed young men would listen, but independent enough to speak with rivals. He could not promise complete safety. He could only create enough time for anger to decrease and information to be checked. Los Angeles eventually built more formal violence reduction programs around this approach. The city's gang reduction and youth development program combined prevention services for young people with intervention work in areas experiencing gang violence. Evaluations found that youth participants showed reductions in risk factors associated with joining gangs, although evidence about neighbourhood-wide crime effects was mixed. That mixed result reflects the difficulty of measuring community work. A program may help individual teenagers while shootings continue because of conflicts involving other people. A neighbourhood may improve while nearby areas do not. A reduction may also be influenced by policing, economic change, or wider crime trends. An honest account does not need to describe every program as a complete success or failure. Some helped. Some were poorly funded. Some worked for a period and disappeared when grants ended. The LAPD also entered a long period of change. The Rodney King case did not permanently resolve questions about force and accountability. In 1993, a federal jury convicted officers Stacey Kuhn and Lawrence Powell of violating King's civil rights, They received prison sentences. The convictions gave the legal system a different answer from the state trial, but they did not restore public trust by themselves. During the late 1990s, the Rampart scandal revealed serious corruption inside an anti-gang unit. Officers were accused of planting evidence, making false arrests, stealing drugs, beating suspects, and committing unjustified shootings. The scandal led to overturned convictions, lawsuits, and another crisis of confidence in the department. The revelations were especially damaging because crash officers had operated in the name of protecting neighbourhoods from gangs. Some of the people given exceptional power to police those neighbourhoods had abused that power. The federal government notified Los Angeles that it intended to bring a civil case alleging a pattern or practice of excessive force, false arrests, and unreasonable searches and seizures. The city entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice, formally approved by a federal court in June 2001. The agreement required major changes involving supervision, use of force review, gang units, confidential informants, officer training, integrity audits, complaint procedures, and community outreach. The decree placed the LAPD under federal monitoring for years. It required the department to collect information, document decisions, identify officers showing patterns of risky behaviour, and increase oversight of specialised units. These reforms changed the institution. They did not remove every complaint or prevent every controversial shooting. Police reform is not a permanent condition reached after completing a list. Rules matter only when supervisors enforce them, officers follow them, investigators examine violations honestly, and residents believe complaints will receive serious attention. The formal consent decree ended in 2009 after a federal judge concluded the department had made sufficient progress. The LAPD later created offices intended to continue constitutional policing oversight. The department that emerged was not the same LAPD that had entered South Central during Operation Hammer. It was more diverse, more closely monitored, and more careful in documenting many uses of force. Distrust remained. Residents who had experienced decades of aggressive policing did not forget, because departmental policy changed. Later controversies involving shootings, stops, surveillance, and gang databases continued raising questions about whether reform had changed the experience of Black and Latino residents on the street. At the same time, many neighbourhoods wanted a reliable police presence. They did not want to return to the years when gunfire, drug markets, and retaliation controlled public space. The challenge remained the same one families had faced during the 1980s, obtaining protection without accepting abuse as its price. Newer approaches attempted to address that problem through longer-term relationships. The Community Safety Partnership placed specially assigned officers in several public housing developments, including places with long histories of gang conflict. Instead of rotating through only for enforcement actions, officers were expected to work with residents, young people, housing officials, and community groups. Evaluations found promising results, including improved perceptions of safety and police-community relationships in some locations. The researchers also identified continuing challenges and uneven effects. The approach depended on something earlier policing models had often treated as unnecessary: time. An officer needed repeated contact with residents outside moments of arrest. Children needed to see police at youth events rather than only during raids. Residents needed to know which officer would return after a complaint. Trust could not be produced by a press conference. It developed through small encounters, and it could be damaged by one serious abuse. Housing conditions changed as well. Some public housing developments were renovated or rebuilt. Jordan Downs, once known nationally through gang reporting, entered a large redevelopment process intended to replace older units and add new housing, streets, parks, and commercial space. Supporters described redevelopment as overdue investment. Residents worried about displacement, changing eligibility, construction disruption, and whether the families who endured the hardest years would remain long enough to benefit. This concern appeared across South Los Angeles as property values rose in parts of the city. neighbourhood improvement could bring better shops, safer streets and new construction. It could also raise rents and attract investors who viewed long-time residents as obstacles to profit. The same family that had remained through gang violence, crack markets, police raids, and the 1992 unrest might later be forced out because the area had become more desirable. Safety and displacement could arrive together. This created another difficult question. What does recovery mean if the neighbourhood improves but the people who survived its worst years can no longer afford to live there? For homeowners, rising values could create wealth. For tenants, they could create instability. South Los Angeles remained a place of unequal outcomes. Some commercial corridors gained investment, others continued struggling with vacant properties, limited grocery access, overcrowded housing, and low-wage employment. The homicide decline did not eliminate trauma. Young people still experience shootings, and South Los Angeles continued to carry a disproportionate share of the city's gun violence. In 2023, the area recorded hundreds of shooting victims, even though violence was far below its early 1990s level. A lower number is not the same as an acceptable number. For the family of one victim, a citywide decline provides little comfort. The long-term lesson was that enforcement alone could not produce lasting safety. Arrests were sometimes necessary. People committing shootings posed a direct danger and had to be stopped. But removing one shooter did not heal the child who witnessed the attack, support the family that lost income, or prevent younger friends from seeking revenge. Programs increasingly began treating trauma as part of violence prevention. Counsellors, hospital responders, intervention workers, and community organisations worked with victims and families after shootings. The goal was not only emotional support. Untreated grief could become the reason for another attack. Helping someone process loss could interrupt retaliation. That idea would have sounded unfamiliar during the height of Operation Hammer, when the city's main language was suppression. It reflected lessons residents had understood for years. Violence spreads through relationships. Prevention must also spread through relationships. Recent Los Angeles programs have continued combining intervention, youth services, and law enforcement. City reporting in 2025 credited community violence, interventionists and partner organisations with major reductions in gang-related homicides and shooting victims in targeted zones during 2024. Those claims come from city data and do not prove that intervention alone caused every reduction, but they show how far official strategy has moved from relying only on arrests and large sweeps. The most dangerous streets did not become safer because one side won. The gangs did not defeat the police. The police did not eliminate the gangs. Residents, demographic change, ageing, economic shifts, imprisonment, intervention work, reforms, medical improvements, and broader national crime trends all contributed to the decline. Some changes came at a high cost. Mass incarceration removed violent offenders, but it also removed large numbers of Black and Latino men for long periods, including people convicted of non-violent drug crimes. Families lost fathers, sons, and income. People returned from prison with limited employment opportunities and stronger connections to prison-based gang structures. A policy could reduce one form of danger while creating another form of instability. That is why the history resists a simple ending. South Los Angeles after 1992 was safer than it had been during the homicide peak. It was not free from gang violence. The LAPD changed substantially. It did not fully escape the distrust created by its earlier conduct. Investment returned to some areas. It did not erase poverty or guarantee that long-time residents would benefit. Crip and Blood identities survived. They no longer organised daily life in exactly the same way on every street where they had once been dominant. People continued living between the public image of the neighbourhood and the reality they knew. Outsiders remembered burning buildings, gangs, and police helicopters. Residents remembered family gatherings, school events, work, church, neighbours, and the efforts that kept many children alive. The word dangerous had always concealed more than it explained. It described the chance of being harmed. It did not describe the people raising families there. It did not describe the residents who negotiated truces, opened youth programs, reported crimes despite fear, challenged police abuse, rebuilt businesses, and stayed when leaving would have been easier. The streets changed because those people continued working after the emergency ended. Some of their work became official policy years later. Much of it was never recorded. A former gang member stopped a rumour before it became a shooting. A teacher kept a student after school. A mother moved a child's bed away from a front window. A minister brought rivals into the same room. A police officer chose to speak rather than immediately use force. A witness finally agreed to testify. None of those actions repaired the city alone. Together, they helped prevent the early 1990s from becoming permanent. Los Angeles still carries the history of the years when neighborhood borders, crack money, firearms, and aggressive policing turned parts of the city into contested territory. The evidence remains in families who lost relatives, men who spent decades in prison, residents who still react to sudden gunfire, and institutions still attempting to earn trust. The record homicide year belongs to the past. The conditions that produced it remain warnings. A city can allow segregation, job loss, weak schools, easy access to firearms, gang retaliation, and police misconduct develop separately until they combine into one crisis. It can then spend enormous amounts of money responding to the violence while continuing to underfund the conditions that prevent it. South Los Angeles showed what that decision costs. It also showed that neighborhoods described only through their worst years can change without forgetting what happened there. The smoke cleared. The streets remained. The people who lived on them continued the work.